Congressional Debate, and 153 competitors. We are down to the final 20. Today we have 16 speakers. We have 4 presiding officers. A couple of things about this session that are a little different from our norm. First off, speech times are 4 minutes long instead of 3 minutes. Questioning times will remain the same, 30-second blocks of direct, 4 blocks for the sponsorship and first negative, 2 blocks for all other speeches. We have 4 presiding officers. The presiding officers will each serve for 8 speeches each. Every competitor is limited to 2 speeches. This is the only round of the tournament where we have a limit on the number of speeches you can provide. Just in case you have not yet discovered it, our internet network here is the Clarion Lexington network. You should not need a password. For judges, you have 2 separate ballots. Ballot number 1 has 16 names on it. It's our traditional Congressional Debate ballot for our 16 speakers. Your second ballot has 4 names on it. That is for our presiding officers. The presiding officers will be ranked just 1 through 4 against each other at the end of the competition, based upon your determination who was the best presiding officer at the competition. This round will end at 1:30 or when every competitor has had 2 speeches. Based upon the time of the round, the extended speeches, we should end significantly before 1:30. Should the session become inefficient, extended recesses, excessive recesses, we may run into that 1:30 time, and at that point, it is unfortunate, but the round will not be extended. So competitors, let us be efficient and effective. At this time, we're going to have a draw for the presiding officer order.
I guess I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
That'll get checked.
The first presiding officer will sit with the parliamentarian. The other 3 will sit at the other table.
Are they numbered?
Yeah. So have the draw number.
Oh, okay. Got it. That's what I thought. All right.
It was either that or random draw order.
All right. I'll start ladies first. Yeah. Representative Kumar is going to be judging 4th, or POing 4th. Senator Mattel will be first. Senator Casey will be second, and I wonder what this is. Senator Wheeler will be third.
At this time, I'm going to say the sweetest words that anybody has ever heard. All standby judges are released.
Knowing that we don't have any PO nominations or PO voting that we have to do, I'm going to pass it off to Senator Mattel. Yes, Senator Mattel, for him to go over the PO procedures. One thing to note as a parliamentarian, didn't think I needed to say this before, but based off of this tournament, one of the things that I am going to ask of the debaters is if I can hear you practicing your speech while somebody is going, that is not going to impact the person who is speaking, but it is going to impact you as far as your rankings go. So please, don't be audible to me. I know that you're speaking this way. Judges might not be able to hear you, but I ultimately will be, and it is distracting. So please be respectful to each other, and let's have a lot of fun.
First of all, massive congratulations on making it to the finals of the 2025 Tournament of Champions. Obviously, this took a lot of hard work. So, to meet the standard y'all set, last night I spent 8 hours on a PO simulator with Sashank. You can find it at sashankbalusu.github.io/POSim. PO and S are capitalized. It's also linked on my PO sheet. Speaking of which, time for the procedural stuff. You guys can all access my PO sheet at tinyurl.com/2025TOC. That's the numbers 2025 and then the letters TOC. Can everyone just confirm access? My apologies. Okay, can y'all try again really quick? Alright, perfect. The preset recency you see on the sheet is not going to be used. Everything will be done off of pure randomness as abiding by TOC procedures. For gavel taps, considering this is going to be 4-minute speeches, they will alter slightly. So that means at 3 minutes you get 1 tap, 3:30 2 taps, 3:55 3 taps. At 4 minutes I'll physically stand, and between 4:05 and 4:10 I'll gavel you down. A reminder, those 10 seconds are a grace period, so please, please, please try your best not to abuse it. For questioning, same thing as usual, 20 seconds 1 tap, 30 seconds I'll verbally cut you off and either move on to the next speaker or the next line of questioning. I do ask that you try and keep your placard raised throughout the questioning period, even if someone else is asking a question, just for the name of speed and efficiency. Obviously, if you realize at the last second that you have a question and put your placard up, I'll still do my best to account for you, but just when you realize you have a question, just start raising your placard. Any questions about procedures? Cool, seeing none, to save as much time as possible, we'll unilaterally open the floor for docket nominations. Do I have any? Representative Guo.
I move to nominate Bill number 1, SLAP, and then 2, Amendment for Pardons.
Second.
Do I have seconds?
Second.
Any opposed?
Motion.
Representative Harian.
Close the floor for docket nominations.
Second.
Any opposed? Seeing none, we'll be unanimously moving forward with docket A, first SLAP, and then pardons. We'll now open the floor for debate. Do I have any sponsorship speeches? Between all those standing, I'll first go to Representative Powers.
I thank the chair. Hello, everybody. Competitors, POs, judges, Farley, and all of these spectators in the back. This is Representative Paul Ortiz, PA-ORTIZ, for your reference, Diego Pauly.
Before you go, I should have said this before. Since we do have a lot of spectators, please put all of your devices on silent so it's not distraction throughout the round. It's going to be really important. If it becomes an issue, we'll probably have to ask you to leave.
Yeah, I would not want a buzz.
Yeah, me neither.
They say journalism is the first draft of history, but today's draft can be completely erased by a single lawsuit. Picture this: a journalist uncovers a case of criminal or a chemical leak into schoolyards. However, overnight they get hit with $350,000 in a fine and lawsuit. These cases weaponize our courts against dissent and make sure that only the truth is available to the very wealthy. Above all, pass this legislation to make sure that ideas are what wins, not intimidation. Now, what exactly is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or a SLAP? Well, it's any lawsuit aimed at not correcting a wrong, but at silencing critique. The Northwestern Journal of Human Rights finds that SLAPs drain resources and chill speech on matters of public concern, deterring journalists, activists, and citizens from speaking out. In Pennsylvania alone, a 2024 anti-SLAP law grants immediate immunity and fee shifting, providing early dismissal works to protect free expression. Yet today, 17 states still lack any anti-SLAP protection, and most other states still have too narrow laws that don't cover it enough. The financial burden is staggering. As a study by the Institute for Freedom of Speech explains, in 2021, the median cost to defend a meritless defamation suit is $39,000, with complex cases topping 6 figures. For your average journalist who doesn't have that much kind of money just ready to burn through, it is a death sentence for them. That's where this legislation steps in. Under Section 1 of my bill, defendants can file a motion to dismiss any case targeting public issue speech, meaning that we halt meritless lawsuits unless there is a strong likelihood of success in the first place. Then, under Section 1A specifically, if a suit is deemed a SLAP, courts have to pay off the attorney's fees for the winning party, meaning that if a company tries to silence a journalist and it is a slap, then they have to still pay the journalist fees. So the journalist doesn't have to pay anything out of pocket in the long run. That means we deter companies from even trying to file these frivolous suits in the first place. In the long run, by letting judges dismiss these slaps at the outset and forcing fee awards where suits fail, we remove the money chokehold before it tightens on the journalists. In my home state of California alone, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press explains that Californians have filed 435 anti-slap motions in a single year, cutting down frivolous claims by 40% and freeing honest reporters to just do their jobs. When speaking truth risks bankruptcy, the powerful win by default. But slaps don't just muzzle speech. They also clog dockets with dead-end cases. When you can fast-track dismissal, judges are able to stay free to focus on the real disputes in court, not just the few cases that companies try to silence. Speeding justice for every single person in America. That same Institute for Freedom of Speech study I cited earlier found that these same anti-slap motions in just the states that already have them save courts roughly 120,000 judge hours every single year. Backlog dockets delay justice for every single American. But if we can expedite the process and save time, that means that Americans who truly have a case to make in court can make it. It means that you don't have to wait 6 months after you file suit to open court. It means you don't have to spend as much money paying all those legal fees while you're waiting. By slashing the price tag of truth and clearing the calendars of intimidation tactics, we can finally end financial coercion and judicial gridlock. Restore the promise of free speech. Pass my legislation.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 4 minutes, 8 seconds. Once again, 4 minutes, 8 seconds. 4 blocks of questioning, all cross-examiners. Representative or Senator Newman.
Why also increase the burden of proof on people facing real defamation?
Because the problem is those 3 cases of real defamation don't actually end up falling under this bill. Because what it has is
Why?
the court has to determine whether or not it even counts as a slap.
The legislation just says you have to prove substantial basis. That applies to any case like defamation, right?
Yeah.
Right, so
it's
that
true
increases the burden of proof for
Yeah.
people actually facing
But if it's
defamation.
true defamation, they're going to meet that burden of proof.
No, because most people don't have legal, the money to pay for an
Senator
attorney to do
Zental.
that, right?
They get
Okay, great speech. So it's important that we protect small journalists that are fact-checking these big companies, right? So how many of those 435 motions you mentioned were actually filed by small journalists?
Not necessarily filed by small journalists because they do have lawyers and other things, but in a lot of those cases, it did represent the interest of these people against companies.
How many cases?
I'm not sure of the specific number. I'm sure
Okay, if I prove to you that it's large companies invoking these stances, would you flip?
Senator Ryan.
Your solvency is that now people can get their attorney fees back, right?
Yeah.
Is this not a power federal courts already have?
Not necessarily, because the thing is, this reinforces that power. This gives another way that judges can make sure they get their money back.
Wait, if we both agree that federal courts can already do this in the status quo,
They can pay it, but it's not mandated by federal law.
wait, this is not mandated either, right? You're just creating that option.
No, we force judges to have, or to be able to mandate it for them.
You're just repeating the status quo. What is the unique solvency under this
Because we
legislation?
Senator
force it
Guo.
by federal law.
Hi, you talk about in your speech how this legislation halts the case after we pass. Where in this legislation does it say that?
What do you mean holds the case?
You said in your speech, word for word, this halts the case. How is it going to halt the case?
I'm not sure what you mean. I'm saying that what happens.
You
is
said it yourself in your speech, word
journalists
for
are,
word.
it blocks the case in the first place from moving on.
Wait, no,
It's a slap.
it just requires that the plaintiffs cover the defendant's
Yeah,
costs.
and if it's a fake case, bogus case.
Where
they're not
does it
gonna
say
meet the
that?
burden.
Thank you, Senators. Seeing as that was a speech on the affirmation, all negation speakers rise. Senator Huckabee.
I thank the chair. That's Senator Huckabee speaking for the first time this session. Judges, there's a lot of you. I'm going to assume you're ready. If you're not, give me a second. Perfect. The slap heard around the world. It wasn't when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. It was in 1996, where 12 cattle farmers decided to sue Oprah Winfrey because she criticized the quality of their meat, making it one of the highest profile slap suits in this nation's history. Unfortunately, though, Not every American is a billionaire like Oprah. Not everyone can cover the costs, protect the costs for defendants, and negate this policy. You failed because you only draw out slap suits and increase the costs for defendants by making them drag out. If Senator Ortiz really wants to help defendants protect against slap suits, he needs to show that this policy actually reduces costs. It doesn't for two key reasons. First, it brings cases to court, only dragging out the time and the cost it takes along the way. As the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press finds, that most slap suits never actually go to court. That's not their purpose. They get settled before either party makes it to the courtroom. That's because the purpose isn't to beat a defendant. It's to intimidate journalists and people who speak out from creating dissent. A big company can just say, I'm going to sue you, and people will back down because of the cost. Senator Ortiz's policy tries to stop that, but it doesn't work because Section 1 just gives defendants false hope that maybe in the future they'll get their costs back. The problem is businesses have every incentive to keep the court cases, while a defendant has everything to lose in the process. As the Buckingham Law writes in March 15th of 2024, that big companies can write off their lawsuit expenses, everything from attorney costs to damages. They pay nothing in the end for continuing a lawsuit, but a defendant does, as the Court of Law Review finds, that defendants still have to pay for these out of pocket if they're a small journalist or an individual on their own. Meaning, if the case goes to court and the defendant ends up losing, the big company, they've lost nothing. The defendant, they've lost everything. That's the other problem with Senator Ortiz's policy. It's not a guarantee that you'll get the benefits from this policy. You have to prove it in Section 1A and 1B. That's not a guarantee. I'd rather preserve the world where people get rid of the suits and don't spend extra money in the process. But the second reason it increases cost is because this policy doesn't pay defendants for applying for this policy. Section 1 only covers the costs for the slap suit itself, the damages, the compensatory costs, and the attorney costs. But it doesn't cover what it would actually need to go to court to get your case overturned and the money back. It's for the people rights that in cases where you want to reverse the effect of a lawsuit, you have to sue to do it. And in Section 1A and 1B, you must prove that the company was intentionally doing it. You must prove that it was purposeful harassment. You need to go to the court of law to do that, and it costs money to do that. As for the people rights, that lawyers cost up to $500 an hour. Senator Ortiz, this policy just places those defendants on an additional burden by having them apply for this policy. If you want any accessibility to Senator Ortiz's impacts, cost needs to go down so defendants are going to actually go down. That's the comparison that should guide today's debate. Do costs increase or decrease under this policy? They only increase. Not everyone is a billionaire. Fight for the regular people and negate this policy.
Thank you, Senator. I believe that these are 4 minutes, 9 seconds, 4 blocks of questioning, all cross-examiners rise. Representative Senator Diego.
Hi. In the status quo, do lawsuits cost defendants money?
Yes.
Yeah. In this world, do defendants recover at least some of that money relative to the status quo?
Two things. One, you're operating under the assumption that this policy is a guarantee. People could go through with the false assumption, wait, I'm going to win this back.
But nonetheless,
you
told me in the status quo, they pay money. In this world, they have the opportunity to regain at least some of it.
Yeah, but then you have to pay the extra money to actually apply for getting the money back. You don't gain anything. If anything,
okay, but still, that's a net benefit over a status quo where they get nothing,
no, it's not.
right?
On net, you lose. Because
Senator
you're at least paying more.
How does this legislation extend the length of trials?
Because they're actually going to court. Most slap suits never touch the courtroom at all. They're
What's
just
the burden of
litigation.
proof on the defendant in the status quo?
prove that like it was a suit.
They have to prove that it's a baseless
Yeah.
suit, like a motion to dismiss. Don't defendants already do that?
No, they settle it outside of court.
Don't defendants have an
I told you
incentive
nearly
to
every single slap suit is settled out of court. That burden of proof never kicks in unless you're.
How does that change into today's legislation? It's not a mandate on defendants.
Because you're giving defendants false hope. Maybe I can get my money back. They'll go to court only
So
losing.
giving them a chance at justice is bad.
What happens to the lawsuit if a company can't prove that it was truly defamation?
Nothing.
Under this law, judges are judges able to dismiss it and mandate that the companies pay the people back?
Sure, but then in order to do that, the defendant needs to apply to the court
No,
to
innocent-
get the judge to agree with
innocent.
them. That costs attorneys.
Innocent until proven guilty. It's literally in the
That's only
Constitution.
criminal charges.
It's also
not civil.
still,
That's
even
not a
so,
civil
this makes it apply in a similar fashion, though, right?
It literally- where does it
Because
say
the
innocent until
company
proven
has to
guilty?
prove.
I'm a little confused. Why do people choose to settle out of court?
Because it costs less money.
Yeah,
Basically-
because they know that they're probably going to lose the case
Yeah,
and
they're
it
probably
also
gonna
costs
lose.
them money. When you pass this legislation, why does this not shift the paradigm for people to be more incentivized to go to court and try their cases?
I literally told you that in my speech. People are going to go to court.
Yeah,
The problem
so
is that a big company is
it
always going
shifts
to win
the
that
burden.
case.
Why? Because now
Because they
it
have
shifts the
more
burden of
resources,
proof.
better attorneys, and all that.
Wait, the reason people don't hire better attorneys is because they can't afford them.
No,
Now
a
they
big
know they
company
can
can
get
always
their
afford
costs
it.
reimbursed.
I told you that it costs to get
Thank
the
you,
costs back,
senators.
nothing's gained.
Seeing that was a speech on the negation, any and all affirmation speakers, please rise. Senator Raouf.
I think the chair. Hello, everybody. That's Senator Raoufi, spelled R-A-O-U-F-I. All the way right here. I know we have like a pretty small judge panel, but I'll just take silence as an indication that everyone's ready. During the civil rights era, local Southern officials used pro-plaintiff standards and frequent lawsuits to make sure that media outlets and local civil rights activists couldn't control the narrative when it came to racial segregation. This tactic silenced the voices advocating for equal rights, maintaining white supremacy in the South, burying media outlets under a costly legal process. For decades, the lawsuit has been a tool of the rich to wage war against the poor. Pass this legislation so that we can ensure that Americans have a shield protecting them against predatory and ill-faith legal practices. Pass this legislation if you want to make sure that when you file a lawsuit, it has to be legitimate. If it's not, you pay the price. If that sounds like justice best served, stand on the affirmation. But quick question, what do people in power do when that power is challenged? The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression on March 18th of 2025 found that President Trump has been involved in more than 4,000 civil lawsuits, including suing CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and even local news sources to punish his critics through expensive and frivolous lawsuits. The Foreign Policy Institute on November 2nd of 2020 found that 73% of investigative journalists reported that they had received communications threatening legal action for information that they had published. For large corporations, they have millions of dollars to spend on legal fees. But for individuals, journals, and nonprofits, they are barely scraping by. Thousands of dollars of legal fees leads to self-censoring. Point blank, they can't afford to speak. Senator Paul Ortiz already proves that this legislation decreases the likelihood of these lawsuits occurring. But I want to take it a step further. Senator Huckabee, even for the lawsuits that do go to court, those afflicted will finally get the compensation that they deserve. This legislation changes the meaning of what it means to be wrongfully sued. Either you go to court over a real concern, or you pay for the harms that you cause. That incentive changes the way that representation is delivered to those without power. The NYU Journal of Legislation and Public Policy on June 15th of 2020 found that rather than self-censorship, an underfunded defense, or needing to use pro bono representation, Shifting the fee to the plaintiff would lead to private attorneys being more willing to increase representation on a contingent basis, meaning that lawyers will accept a case on these lawsuits because they know that their check is coming from the people that they are fighting against. Simply put, we eliminate the cost of doing what is right. Whether it's news outlets, advocacy groups, or individuals that just want to stand up for their communities. Today, we protect their mission by guaranteeing stronger representation. And that mission can't be compromised. The International Journal of the Press found that an improvement of just 1% in media freedom would decrease corruption levels by 18%. For informing the public of the devastating reality in their hometowns. Americans are awarded court papers instead of a Pulitzer. Give them their rights back by affirming this piece of legislation. We shall overcome. A motto used during the civil rights movement. A message that stands today. Corporations and the government have used their power to shut Americans out. Overcome
Thank you, Senator
today.
Rowley, for that speech of 4 minutes, 10 seconds. Once again, 4 minutes, 10 seconds. We're now once again in line for 2 blocks of questioning. All cross-examiners are please. Representative or Senator Huckabee.
Every single benefit you pull is dependent on costs going down for defendants, right?
Right.
Defendants have to pay the cost of applying for this policy.
The biggest misconception is that costs increase. No, because the plaintiff has to pay for all legal costs under this
And
legislation.
they'll have to pay when you actually apply for the policy.
The
funds back only count for the
Senator,
slap suit,
when
not
you
the
pass,
suit
Senator,
applied to get
if I can answer your question, when you pass this legislation, the plaintiff has to pay for every single legal expense.
Yeah, and the defendant has to
Senator,
pay
if I can
Senator
respond,
Song.
if it's a frivolous expense.
Hey, Senator, you cited President Trump's thousands of lawsuits, right?
Right.
So what happened to President Trump and his lawyers when the court found these frivolous lawsuits?
Nothing happened.
No, President Trump was
the
sanctioned by $1
defendants-
million.
Okay.
Doesn't that put your existing mechanisms in the status quo to handle slap
That's like-
lawsuits?
I'm really glad you brought that up. Some states have these anti-slap laws, but other states don't. Passing this legislation increases the federal regulations so that every single state can have these regulations.
Right, but when they're existing, like even if like plaintiffs can choose, like
In
defendants,
some
they
states,
don't have to be in a state.
these
Senators.
protections exist.
Seeing that that was a speech on the affirmation, any and all negation speakers. That'll first go to Senator Nguyen.
Thank you. That's Senator Nguyen, spelled Nguyen. Just nod when you're ready. Parsons v. Bridgman in 1665 marked one of the first ever defamation lawsuits in America. Sarah Bridgman called Mary Parsons a witch. So Mary's husband got so mad that he filed for defamation. That was the first. But the most famous comes in modern day with Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard. What started as a fight between normal folk over witches became a fight in Hollywood between the rich. But should the rich to defend your name depend on whether you're a witch or the rich? If you believe that everyday plaintiffs deserve a chance to clear their name, then don't take away their protection. First, Senator Paul Ortiz of Roe says this bill allows critics and journalists to get away from intimidating lawsuits. But it's not like corporations are just going to give up. If they have millions of dollars for influence and lawyers, they'll just look for another way to tie whistleblowers up in more legal battles and protect their companies. Senator Rufy, scroll down under NYU evidence. NYU Law Review finds in June 15th of 2020, through the Lanham Act, companies can claim critics made false and misleading statements. Through Section 1985, companies can say they're infringing on their civil rights. Through the Copyright Act, companies can say they're misusing their materials. And in the Civil RICO statutes, companies can accuse them for being in a racketeering organization. Senator Paul Ortiz, even if big corporations can no longer win over defamation suits, they can keep defendants tied by federal statutes. Will they win? Probably not. Will it waste time and money from the critic? Absolutely. I mean, many of these people are unemployed. They're struggling to pay for rent. They're trying to provide for their families. They don't have the ability to pay legal battles. They don't have the ability to even hire a lawyer or understand what's going on. Senator Arufi, even with today's legislation, costs don't go down for the defendant. And Senator Ortiz, that means backlog actually increases because now corporations are going to more federal statutes. So if today's legislation doesn't affect the big corporations that the affirmation wants to take down, who does it affect? Plaintiffs that are average people who don't have the complex knowledge of law because they didn't get a GED from a law school, or they don't have the money to buy a lawyer for themselves. Not to mention, paying extra legal fees is terrifying for a middle-income American who can't even afford a $600 expense, who can't even afford groceries next week. But here's why today's legislation is uniquely harmful for them. Yale Law Journal writes in February 20th of 2021 that to survive an anti-slap mention in defamation cases, proving actual malice usually requires discovery, which takes place during the hearing. This legislation in Section 1A requires the proof to be given at the beginning of the trial in order to prove it's possible to win. Wait, but you can't do that without discovery and evidence. This means the plaintiff has to prove victory before evidence, which can only happen in the most extreme cases. You want to know what helps with that? Money, lawyers, another win for corporations, and more losses for the average American. So now, low and middle income Americans or small businesses are pretty much priced out of defamation lawsuits because it's extremely hard to prevent the dismissal of your case and they can't afford to pay thousands in legal fees. Sure, we might take a few frivolous lawsuits out, but the large corporations that are abusing this right now will just use loopholes. This policy leads to valid, true, and genuine lawsuits not being heard and Americans not getting justice. When real defamation cases are thrown out left and right, they are left behind. Stats Pearls, a peer-reviewed leading professional healthcare education and technology company, writes in January 25th of 2023, when facing defamation, people can lose reputation to the point where they lose their customers, services, and see a $300,000 in damages. Senator Ortiz, we're not talking about corporations, we're talking about real Americans, small businesses. My mom, when she had to close down her liquor store because months and months of lawsuits prevented her from paying for my education. Those are real people. They matter too. Don't pass a blanket policy.
Thank you, Senator. You went for that speech of 4 minutes, 8 seconds. I think 4 minutes, 8 seconds. 2 blocks of questioning, cross-examination. Between all of those standing, that will first go to Senator Parker.
So what's the comparative in today's debate? It's between a world where slap suits exist in 17 states and in 0
is that
states.
the defendants won't have a better advantage because, like, the corporation.
Then why do defendants have a better advantage in 74% of our union?
Anti-slap laws is different with this legislation. This legislation.
No, it's not. It follows UPAPA guidelines, which is what 11 states have.
Is that it requires the substantial proof to be proved at the beginning. You can't do that without evidence.
Anti-slap statutes in states already have
It doesn't
that.
prove substantial basis.
Hi, Senator. If someone defames you, how hard is it to prove the burden of proof?
It's really hard if you don't have enough money to understand legal code.
If someone defames you openly, how hard is it to go to a judge and explain your case?
It's really hard, especially if the other person has tons of money.
What does this have to do with money? It's a matter of if someone defames you or
Then you can pay
not.
for a lawyer.
You don't necessarily have to have the best.
If you're an
lawyers.
average American, you don't have enough money to pay for a high quality lawyer.
These judges just want to hear if you even have a case. It doesn't matter what type of
The
lawyer.
lawyer is there to ensure that that case goes
Right, but it doesn't have anything to do
Thank you,
with
Senators. Speakers on the speech on negation, affirmation speakers pause. Between all of those standing, that will first go to Senator Baldwin.
Chair, Senator Bodduluri spelled Bodduluri first time today. Give me a quick second.
Not all of you know, probably always going to be ready if I'm not always late enough. Yeah.
Judges, if y'all are already silent, I'll take it sides of indication. I'm just going to let some spectators filter in before I begin. I see the door closing. Shots happen. Take it aside. Ready for me? Speaking the truth, even when faced with forces striving to silence it, demands staggering courage. For right now, our laws let the powerful leave the ordinary dry, burying the truth in bills, turning courage into a currency few can afford. But when it costs everything to be courageous, who will be courageous? lose. When the courage to tell the truth is taxed, only the coward and the liar will win. Pass this bill to leave no truth defenseless. The negation's vocal concern is that this law falls with equal force on every single suit. So as Senator Wen protests, this means it's harder for every plaintiff to win their case, even real victims with completely valid suits. I think this confuses how the legal system deals with slaps, even when Senator Rye tells you that the legal system can already waive fees. An anti-slap law does not automatically kill any lawsuits. Instead, it creates a structured two-step process that engages both sides of the suit early and often. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press explains in 2019, first, defendants bear the initial burden to affirmatively show that the lawsuit is targeting protected speech when they file their motion. Senator Nguyen, if that motion is accepted, then and only then does the burden shift to the plaintiff to present evidence that their complaint has merit. Senator Huckleberg, this also means that motions to dismiss are more successful, which means even if businesses can afford it, they are not going to be able to drag out trials in court cases. In other words, as the 2022 Institute for Free Speech corroborates, pass our bill to screen out meritless claims and allow the meritorious ones to proceed faster by providing a mechanism to establish those merits earlier on in the litigation process. Senator Rye, this is the solvency that doesn't exist because compare this to the status quo without anti-slap laws, where if a judge accepts the defendant's motion, the plaintiff doesn't get to submit evidence saying, hey judge, I have a legit case here. Their case just gets thrown out, tossed. Now, the negation is also concerned that anti-slap laws will discourage people from suing to begin with. 3 layers of analysis on why disincentivizing lawsuits is never as bad as you think it is. First, Senator Nguyen's argument about discouraging good faith lawsuits cold concedes the fact that this bill works. If plaintiffs with legitimate lawsuits are afraid to sue, ones with frivolous suits won't touch a courtroom with a 50-foot pole. Senator Huckleberg, this also means that less cases are going to court in the first place. But second, the bar for proving your lawsuit isn't frivolous is so insanely low. You just need to produce some legal backing for your claim. Any plaintiff who has legitimate evidence can easily survive the anti-slap motion. If this policy is enough to get you from going to court, either your lawsuit is frivolous, or second, you never cared about it enough to pursue it anyways. That means the consequences of not suing are negligible. But third and finally, slap cases are the only instance in our justice system where you can do nothing wrong, win the case, and still lose in the end. The National Law Review wrote in October of 2023, successfully defending against a slap costs a small business $100,000 on average and can bankrupt an individual. Senator Nguyen, nobody goes bankrupt because they cannot sue. Injustice doesn't mean losing a lawsuit you should have won. It means not being forced to fight one you should have never had to see anyways. When the truth costs too much, the truth dies. Pass this bill to let the truth stand tall.
Thank you, Senator Bonaluri, for that speech. 4 minutes, 3 seconds. Once again, 4 minutes, 3 seconds. 2 blocks of questioning. All cross-examiners is yours. Now, first, go to Senator Ahmed.
Why are less cases going to court a good thing?
It's less frivolous cases going to court, right? This makes it so that it's a two-way road, right? Less frivolous cases aren't able to go to court because they have a burden of proof.
You agree with Senator Nguyen that good faith cases aren't going to go to court because they're intimidated. Again, why is
No,
that?
I don't agree with him. I don't agree with him.
You agree with Senator Nguyen, but you
No.
also
I'm
said
telling Senator
frivolous
Nguyen
cases
that
won't
if
go to
his
court.
concern is good faith lawsuits won't go to court, that's not true.
Why
Because
stop
now you
this
have the
good
ability to
faith?
try them
Senator
before you're
Horn.
going to court.
Where in this legislation does it allow these motions to begin at the beginning of a trial?
That's actually just how the legal system works.
Wait,
It's
no.
called a pre-trial motion.
Okay, you can tell me that, but this legislation doesn't mention anything about the beginning of a case.
What does pre-trial mean? What does the word pre mean? Before, preceding. That's what exists already.
It doesn't mention pre-trial.
It doesn't have
This
to mention it because it
legislation-
already
Wait,
exists.
it's absolutely up to the interpretation. If it doesn't mention it in the beginning, why are you
There is no
interpreting it that way?
interpretation because it's the letter of the law that exists. A pre-trial motion is the status quo.
But you're assuming that in the status quo. This is a
I'm not assuming that. Chair.
Chair, thanks you. Seeing that that was speech on the affirmation, negation speakers, Senator Song on those.
Hey everyone, this is Senator Daniel Song, S-O-N-G. Hoping my speech is your favorite song. I'm on Spotify tomorrow.
Motion.
Say that. Granted, for future reference, please do that in between, like, don't do it after speaker is recognized.
All my judges could just give me a thumbs up when they're good to go.
And then you also please wait for Senator Claus.
Yeah, absolutely. Just wait until we leave it.
Give him a sec. A lot of speakers.
And that counts. Judges should stop me if you're not ready, otherwise I'll get started. The word defamation is thrown around a lot. But what does defamation in America actually look like? It's an online tabloid manipulating videos of teenagers to deliberately embarrass them. It's a group of lawyers barging into the nursing home of an elderly former healthcare worker to harass him on whether he manipulated his former employer to put him in his will. And it's like right-wing conspiracy theorist Alex Jones saying the Sandy Hook school shooting was a hoax, and the mothers and fathers of the victims were paid actors. That's what defamation looks like in this country. You're going to fail this legislation for 3 key reasons. First, because this legislation would empower defendants to make defamation claims with no recourse to the plaintiffs. Second, because there are existing legal mechanisms to combat slap lawsuits. And third, because corporations will always find a way to protect their own reputations. But first, Senator Wen starts off this debate by citing the Yale Law Journal. Let's go a bit further in his source. The Yale Law Journal in February of 2021 explains that the Supreme Court principle of the New York Times versus Sullivan established that to prove defamation, plaintiffs must first prove actual malice on the part of the defendants to defame and harm their reputation. But what is actual malice? As the Cornell Law Review explains last year, actual malice is an extremely difficult and high standard to meet because it requires more than just a lot of evidence, like Senator Bauder seems to say that, the defendants were defamatory. More than that, it requires a clear and convincing intent on the part of the defendants to deliberately harm the reputation of the plaintiffs. But then, how do you figure out this clear and convincing intent? As the Yale Law Review furthers, it requires discovery in the court process. But what's discovery? Discovery is where the plaintiffs and defendants and the lawyers get together in the room and the opposing side asks each other questions to further determine what the goal and intentions of the defendants were. But ironically, this legislation prevents discovery from even happening in the first place because the Reporters Journal Consortium explains 2 years ago that anti-slap lawsuits empower defendants to file a motion to dismiss before the case can even go to court and a sentence of discovery can be ordered. So what does this mean for today's debate? That means the defendants now have the legal privilege and right to essentially dismiss lawsuits without having to go to discovery and for the plaintiffs to even get a fair shot at proving that they were defamed. But then, let's actually take a look at some of Senator Paul Ortiz's claims. He said that, hey, in Pennsylvania, frivolous lawsuits went down. But then, how do we even know these lawsuits were frivolous if there was no chance of them going to court and for the plaintiffs to get a fair shot to prove actual malice? The entire affirmation just assumes the lawsuits filed are inherently frivolous without giving the plaintiffs a chance to even make their case in court and go through the discovery process. The affirmation's evidence all says, hey, frivolous lawsuits went down. But how can you tell a lawsuit is frivolous if they don't actually go to discovery and meet the legal standard of actual malice? The affirmation is in this catch-22 because they want to force plaintiffs to meet the burden of New York Times versus Sullivan without giving them any recourse to do so because defendants can just waive this legislation and act as an unpenetrable legal barrier. But second, let's actually take a look at the status quo of federal protection against slap lawsuits. Senator Raoufi cites President Donald Trump's 4,000 frivolous lawsuits. But let's take a closer look. CBS News writes, in June of 2023, that President Donald Trump was fined $1 million by the federal court system for filing his frivolous lawsuits. That's because, as a Loyola Law Review writes in September of 2021, Federal Rule 11 of the Civil Court Procedure already allows courts to sanction lawyers for deliberately filing slap lawsuits. That legal mechanism is already in place. This Congress just needs to fund awareness and recognition so lawyers can use it. We don't need this legislation. A third environment, corporations will always lobby for exemptions, get tax breaks from lobbyists at this Congress. That doesn't change under this legislation. It doesn't impact structural change in this country, but only gives defendants unfettered immunity. That means you must negate to protect the actual right of the
Senator
plaintiffs.
Song for that speech of 4 minutes, 10 seconds. Once again, 4 minutes, 10 seconds. $2 for questioning, all cross-examination. Senator Araya.
Hi, so I'm a little confused. If discovery is about discovering intent, why does this bill uniquely get rid of that?
Because before the discovery process can be initiated, they have to go to court for the court to organize that discovery. But right now, defendants can just prevent the case from even going to court in the first place by filing a motion to dismiss.
Why can't we just move that discovery process to later in the session? Why does it have to
That's
happen?
not how the court process works.
Well, why
Discovery is
doesn't
part of
this
the
bill
court
change
process.
that? Is the whole point not to
No,
change the
this bill,
system?
combined with New York Times versus Sullivan, creates this impenetrable legal shield for defendants because they can file a
Why
motion
can't
to
they,
dismiss
why
without
can't they
giving
move this
Junior.
later?
Hi.
Hi.
In the status quo, if I'm a journalist who gets sued for defamation, and it's a legitimate case, if the plaintiff in that suit wins, don't they get civil damages awarded to them?
Right, if the plaintiffs win, they do get damages, correct?
Okay, yeah, so even if the burden of proof continues to rest on the plaintiffs, aren't they still going to win legitimate cases if they can convince judges and
No, the plaintiffs have the
juries?
burden of proof, but they don't have the legal means to actually ask the defendant for evidence that might help prove their burden of proof. Like without discovery, there's no reasonable way for the plaintiffs to even get evidence to make a case for themselves.
But
That's
still,
what this legislation
Thank you,
does.
Senators. Take that. Granted. Quality in the back, granted. Seeing that was a speech on the negation, any and all affirmation speakers, please rise. Senator Guo.
I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber and judges, that's Senator Guo, spelled G-U-O. For the reference of the chamber and judges, again. I'm at the leisure of all those above me, so I'll just take a moment to ensure my judges in the back can hear me, as well as my constituents in the back. All good? Perfect. My judge in court. All right, on my first word then. Big Pharma's innovation dominates over smaller universities, and for-profit hospitals are crushing community health centers. And last but not least, mega corporations are swallowing up small mom-and-pop landlords. Private power is seeping into every aspect of Americans' lives. Please, don't let it plague this Congress too. Pass this legislation so that our constituents finally have a fighting chance over big money. First, very simply, the affirmation wins today's debate because we have reality on our side. In all of the negation studies, not a single one of them cited past precedent of their concern materializing into real life in those states where anti-SLAPP lawsuits have already been placed. You're going to see why past precedent is on the affirmation side today in my speech. First, our sponsor and Senator Yuki already told you that suits these days aren't filed to win, they're filed to silence. But not only that, here's an example of it in action in local communities, and not just for local journalists, Senator Ortiz, but also for local activists and local newspapers. After only 20 workers protested Murray Energy headquarters in the state without anti-SLAPP laws, CEO Bob Murray sued not only protest organizers, but also the Chagrin Valley Times for simply covering the story. The National Research Council reports in August 2020 that the multi-year suit ended up costing that local publication hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And it's been used many more times since. Activists, environmentalists, and whistleblowers are being silenced and financially crushed by SLAPPs. We need to address it, which is why we need this bill. Section 1A and B. If a case is ruled as SLAPP, it requires the plaintiff to pay off the defendant's legal costs. But here's the explanation Senator Paul Ortiz misses in questioning when I asked why a case falls. If they're awarded the plaintiff's legal costs, then even if this case drags on Senator Huckabridge, it's basically a guarantee of the defendant's win because the court already established that the plaintiff's claim was illegitimate and frivolous. It basically says, if you can't win the argument, you shouldn't be able to buy their silence. And not only that, Senator Paul Ortiz already told you that 33 states already have anti-SLAPP laws, and it's already been a success. Let me add one more metric to that. The Golden Gate University School of Law furthers that courts ultimately side with defendants in 77% of SLAPP cases. But Senator Nguyen and Son are concerned. That's 23% of cases, though, where the plaintiff wins. If we bought their explanation, then the plaintiffs would win 0% of the time. But clearly, that's not the case. So why do they win? Because these courts have discretion. They're smart. They know when a case is actually legitimate. But moving on, Senator Huckabee also tells us that states aren't delivering on this promise. But this is proof that they're delivering on this promise as we speak. Because a few scattered states having anti-SLAPP laws, though, means nothing. That's why you uniquely need this federal policy. The Journal of Legislation and Public Policy in June 2020 explains it best. Without a national policy, plaintiffs simply foreign shop as they file cases in states without anti-SLAPP laws so that they can do it with more success, considering that SLAPP protections never come into play. And this means that sexual assault victims, depending on where they live geographically, often don't get the chance to speak out. Look at Ray and Mendina and Chelsea Todders, two women who Pitchfork Media tells us bravely came forward in 2018 after being drugged and raped by a producer. They tried to sue them into silence, but California's anti-SLAPP law protected them and stood between them and the abuser. They threw out the case, and they were no longer left with any fees. But survivors know they can come forward without financial repercussions. Don't do it.
Thank you, Senator.
Pass.
Roll over that speech of 4 minutes, 10 seconds. Once again, 4 minutes, 10 seconds. 2 blocks of questioning all across the executive. Senator Bhattacharya.
Hi, when are anti-SLAPP suits filed? Before evidence or after evidence?
What do you mean?
When do you file an anti-SLAPP?
Before evidence.
Yeah, if I can't prove with evidence that I'm right, how can
Wait, I gave you empirics in my speech about how plaintiffs can actually win anti-SLAPP cases. Because even though it's filed before the actual evidence of the case.
But at the
Wait.
end of the day, how can I prove anything if I don't have evidence?
I was getting to that. You file the main evidence of the case in the main part of the trial, but in the pre-trial portion where you're filing the anti-SLAPP, you provide evidence of the
Senator,
anti-SLAPP being false.
Wait, in the pretrial, you're not providing any evidence, right? What grounds can plaintiffs get
I'm not
substantial
saying
basis?
pre-trial like the actual official portion that's called pre-trial. I'm saying before the trial is happening.
But yeah, before the trial happens, that's
Yeah.
when you're supposed to prove substantial basis, right?
Correct.
Do they have the evidence then?
No, the evidence, the main part of the evidence is presented to the jury in court. This
Yeah.
anti-SLAPP
Yeah, right.
you have to provide evidence to show that anti-SLAPP
So if the
law
evidence
is not
isn't provided
court.
in the beginning, doesn't this legislation not
Wait,
allow plaintiffs
nowhere
to
does
win?
it say that evidence can't be provided before. If they want you to prove an anti-SLAPP law, they should.
Senators.
Move to approve, Mr.
Great, granted. As a note to spectators, please wait until after speakers are done speaking to exit the chamber. I noticed some people left in the middle of the questioning block. Please try and refrain from that in the future.
Move to a point of personal privilege.
State that. Granted. Seeing that was a speech on the affirmation, any and all negative speakers, please pause. That'll go to Senator Horn to vote.
Thank the chair. The chamber, that's Senator Horn, spelled H-O-R-N-E. Once again, Senator Horn, H-O-R-N-E. Judges, whenever you're ready, like always.
And then Senator Horn, can you wait for Senator?
Of course. Are any of my judges not ready? In 1992, Stella Liebeck, a 79-year-old woman, was sitting in her grandson's car with a cup of McDonald's coffee. In the next 7 seconds, when she spilled it on her lap, she received third-degree burns over more than 10% of her body. In the ensuing lawsuit, she wasn't met with support, but a media firestorm. People who'd rather listen to controversy than context, fraud rather than facts. When we're indicting our constituents' right to speech and to public trial, I'm not willing to let our mistakes spill onto their rights, negate. Every single speaker in today's round isn't operating under our current context. Your legislation and this debate is to operate within a world where anti-SLAPP lawsuits are working, where the laws we have in place to prevent SLAPP lawsuits are actively helping your constituents. Senators Derringer, Parties, Ralphie, and Quo all tell you anti-SLAPP laws work. I tell you that's the reason you negate today's legislation, because justice isn't dead in our streets. It's already working, as the Institute for Free Speech finds in November 2nd of 2023. In 79% of the population, we see them covered by anti-SLAPP laws in the status quo. It's the burden on the affirmation to prove that in those other 20% of cases, that's the reason to affirm. But if they don't prove to you that this law is better for 80% of our constituents, I tell you to negate this legislation. And even in those 20%, we see those states already moving towards anti-SLAPP laws in our status quo. As a public participation project finds in 2022, all but 4 anti-SLAPP laws that went on the ballot saw unanimous support across the board. I reject the analysis that we don't see anti-SLAPP laws working in the status quo. They are, but that's the reason that you negate today, because this legislation overrides them with something worse. In our status quo, if the federal government passes a law that overrides state law, you have to focus on how it changes the status quo. Right now, Senators Baudelaire, Parties, Ralphie, Nguyen, you all don't understand how anti-SLAPP laws actually work. But as the Institute for Free Speech tells us, the procedural aspect of anti-SLAPP laws dismiss the case at the start of a trial. Senator Baudelaire told me that this legislation does the same. I tell you, think like a lawyer, because that's what they're going to do when they read this legislation. Nowhere does it tell you any defendant has the right or the power to dismiss a lawsuit. At any point in the case, the only impact on solvency of this legislation is that at the end of a trial, a defendant can try to get money back, but that doesn't work if they're already bankrupt. As Novian Law finds on October 19th of 2024, if a case ever progresses to the first part of a trial, defendants can see the cost of a lawyer rise above 6 figures when the Federal Reserve tells us in October 18th of 2023 that the median savings for a person in under 65 is just $8,000. That $100,000 they have to pay is what bankrupts them at the start. Senator Baudelaire, I'm really glad that at the end of a lawsuit, they can get some money back. If they're already bankrupt, they're never going to have the funds to prove that discovery when that occurs. Senator Park, anti-SLAPP laws exist. The problem with this legislation is it overrides them and replaces it with something worse. Senator Quasi, for 80% of the country, the people who you tell me don't have any justice already do. I ask you not to sacrifice their rights, their powers, for something that's worse. Don't let the mistakes of our past spill onto our constituents.
4 minutes,
Negate.
10 seconds. Once again, 4 minutes, 10 seconds. 2 blocks of questioning, all cross-examination. Between all of those standing, that will first go to Senator Ryder.
Is discovery the only way to get evidence before a trial?
Like it's the main way.
Right. What is another way that is almost used in every case to get evidence?
You can hire like an outside investigator.
You can order a subpoena, which costs you nothing. Why can't defendants just use that to get the evidence you want?
2 responses. First, the problem with ordering a subpoena is it still requires a lawyer who's good enough to know what subpoenas they need. For plaintiffs who already don't have enough money to hire good lawyers, they're not going to do what you're
doesn't that
asking.
mean that they can still get the evidence without needing discovery?
No, because they don't have
Senator
good
Blow.
lawyers to do so. Yeah.
Hi, when we're legislating, we focus on what doesn't work in the status quo.
Yeah.
In those 30% of SLAPP cases that are, 20% that aren't covered by anti-SLAPP laws, why are they not working right now?
Wait, they are. We're literally seeing them.
Wait, you said 20% aren't being
Hold on.
covered.
They're moving towards anti-SLAPP laws in the status quo. When you pass this legislation to replace 80% of the country with a worse version of the
Wait,
same.
no, we're making a federal policy that covers everyone. We're not
Yeah, which is
superseding
objectively
it.
worse
We're
for
adding
80% of the country.
for the states that already, for
Thank
example.
you, Senators.
Given that we're through 8 speeches, thank you, Senator Mittal, for presiding. Bring up Senator Casey for the second set.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, that's Senator Casey. I'm truly so honored to be your second presiding officer today. Once again, I want to reiterate thank you to P.O. Mittal for starting off this session. I want you to continue debate as fast as possible, but before that, I'm going to go over some of the procedure. For my PO sheet, I have a tiny URL link. It is tinyurl.com/finalstoc. Pretty straightforward, but that's tinyurl.com/finalstoc. On the first half of the sheet, there are links to the bills, the tabloid page, the NSDA rules, the TOC-specific rules, and the dockets to make the judges' and competitors' job as easy as possible. There's additionally precedence and recency for questioning and speeches. Per page 3 Rule 3 of TOC regulation, preset recency isn't allowed, so we can be continuing off the policy of the previous presiding officer and just go off what's been established so far.
On the second tab, there's additional information on procedure, TOC-specific amendments, which differs from the NSDA rules, and even a fully anonymous trigger warning form for if competitors or judges have any triggers that they want me to communicate to the chamber not to use to make sure that this session can be as equitable as possible. For the sake of efficiency, we're going to be keeping the exact same gathering procedure as the previous presiding officer, except the only difference is that I will begin lightly gathering you down at 4 minutes rather than 4 minutes and 5 seconds, considering that half of the speeches so far have gone to 4 minutes and 10 seconds, which under Rule 9 of page 3, TOC rules specifically penalizes, so I want to enforce that. As a brief note to the chamber, under Robert's Rules of Order, it explicitly states that if a speaker has the floor, the point of personal privilege is entirely out of order, and as your presiding officer, I need to stick to that, so please do point of personal privilege between speeches. And on that note, that concludes my procedure, so...
Point of personal privilege to answer.
Granted. With that, once again, the tiny URL is tinyurl.com/finalstoc. tinyurl.com/finalstoc. Are there any other questions on my procedure? With that, seeing as we left off on a speech on the negation, we're now lining for an affirmative speech. All affirmative senators, please rise for Harrigan.
I thank the chair and my judges. That's Senator Harrigan for the first time today. Go ahead and start with any quick indication that you're ready. Judge on the far right, are you ready? Great. In 1733, John Petersanger was arrested for seditious libel against the colonial governor of New York. In what would set the precedent for free press in this country today, he was subsequently acquitted by jury nullification and continued to print the truth, the whole truth, and only the truth. When today, empty lawsuits threaten the very values that this country has upheld for centuries, it's time to return to our roots, Congress. Pass this policy. Now, before I get to my point, let's go down every negation argument so far and see why their impacts simply don't stand. First of all, Senator Huckabridge tells you that this piece of legislation will cost defendants more and make defendants go to court. Two things. First of all, the latter is not true. Defendants under this piece of legislation are not being forced to go to court. You can still settle slap cases before you reach that room. But second, this bill stipulates if a slap suit is filed without a proper basis, your costs are reimbursed. It doesn't matter if costs are rising if you're getting the money back anyway. But second, Senator Nguyen tells us that companies have other loopholes to file these suits through. That's non-unique. In the status quo, companies can still file suits through all these loopholes that are in the status quo. Also, this bill doesn't say malice must be proven before a court case, meaning that they don't have to go through that process before. Third, Senator Song, this legislation doesn't get rid of discovery. I don't understand that point. The point of discovery is to discover intent of a slap case. This bill literally stipulates that defendants and plaintiffs have to find the cause of intent. It's not going away. The system is just being reformed. But finally, Senator Horn just came up here and told you that the majority of states already have great slap laws. So why should we change the system? Sure, 35 states have current anti-slap laws. 15 don't. I'm not willing to leave behind 30% of our country just because the other parts are more advantaged than they are. But what's the real impact of today's round? What decides your vote today? 2 words: free press. Senator Ortiz and Raouf already touched on this. Let me reiterate and show you why this impact is the most important in today's round. First of all, slaps against media have been rising like crazy. The Thomson Reuters Foundation told us in 2023 that slaps against media have risen substantially since 2015, with half of all journalists saying that their newsroom has experienced legal action due to the things that they report. I agree, Senator. We need some context. Let's see what's happening right now with those slap lawsuits. Vox told us in December of 2024 that Trump's lawsuits against ABC and the Des Moines Register are, by definition, slap suits. This is key. Trump has made it clear in the past that he knows exactly what he's doing with these suits. He wants to induce costs and establish fear of the press speaking out against him. Our current president doesn't want to uphold the values of this very Constitution that we rest our bases on. Senator Song, I don't care if Trump was fined $1 billion. Today, when I see threats to our Constitution, I pass this policy and make sure that they're mitigated. It's embarrassing that with what was done 300 years ago, this Congress can't do today.
4 minutes and 10 seconds. My apologies for having to cut you off. Reminder not to use grace period. Questions, please rise. Senator Song, unopposed.
Hi, Senator. So to win an anti-slap lawsuit, you have to be able to get to defamation. To get to discovery, right?
Well, under this legislation, you'll have to prove that there was
No, but you're
basis
caught in a catch-22 where to get to discovery, you first have to prove actual malice. But to prove actual malice, you need evidence which comes from discovery. Your legislation traps plaintiffs in a catch-22 situation.
I don't understand why you can't present evidence. That doesn't make
They
sense.
can get evidence in the discovery process. But to get discovery, you have to prove actual malice.
Then you find other ways to get
You're
evidence.
getting caught. The
And
other
you find
ways
ways
that
around
are
the system.
inferior to discovery.
I'm not
have a
leaving
limited scope.
30% of our country behind
I'll
in
break
this
off recency. You told me that the costs are coming from the college.
Yeah.
What about the costs? Go to free trial. Go to trial, but get the benefit.
It says all costs will be reimbursed.
No, only for the slap lawsuit.
Sure.
Not the lawsuit it takes to get the benefit of the policy.
I would
Like
argue.
hire the lawyers and everything.
Why does that matter?
Because now defendants have to pay more money to get the benefits. You're still losing money.
They do that in the status quo. That's not unique.
Exactly. So your policies are.
That still happens right now. What this
Policies
is
are
make that system
Thank you.
better.
With that, we're speaking on the question from ABC. Did seeing that as an affirmative speech, we're now line for negation speech. All negative speakers, please rise. Senator Don Hall, unopposed. As you notice in the chamber, the past 3 negative speeches in a row have all been unopposed, so if we can just make sure that everybody is ready to speak so we don't need to move into recesses.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Senator Oxton Hall. My last name is spelled D-A-N-T-A-L. Just a nod, smile, thumbs up. In April of 2020, Fox News proudly broadcasted President Trump's advice on receiving tremendous amounts of sunshine and bleach to cure COVID. Now, I live in the rural farms of Ohio, which isn't like the sunniest place in the country, so I thought I was screwed. But luckily, I had an ACLU subscription. I knew the truth. But for thousands of other neighbors, constituents, and people I grew up with in my district, they didn't have that same privilege. Because when nonprofits can't force big corporations to tell the truth, no one is telling the truth. Fail. Because anti-SLAPP can be used by large media to silence fact-checking nonprofits, reading health misinformation, and increasing vaccine hesitancy. Now, Senator Ortiz, Rufy, and Badalori all look at today's debate with too narrow of a scope. It's not just small NGO investigative journalists that will invoke anti-SLAPP. It's also going to be the misinforming companies all of us hate that will be able to hide behind anti-SLAPP laws. There's a reason Senator Ortiz couldn't substantiate his evidence in questioning. There are a lot of anti-SLAPP motions, but they're being invoked by corporations against the investigative journalists. Analysis from the Reporters Committee just this month finds that in Texas, 37% of all anti-SLAPP motions, that's 105 cases, were brought forth by the corporation in a lawsuit where the nonprofit was the plaintiff. Why? Because there's an inherent incentive for big corporations to use anti-SLAPP as a shield to get small NGO lawsuits dismissed. Now that's turned Senator Ortiz and Ralphie solvency. The poor lose the war when you pass a universal anti-SLAPP law that applies to both investigative nonprofits and large corporations. That's why I differ with Senator Nguyen. It's not the 80-year-old Lanham Act that's going to be declared null and void if we pass that muddles up cases. It's going to be this act's solvency and sweeping provisions. Let's go back to Senator Song's Yale source, which argues when large companies are sued by nonprofit watchdogs, like an ACLU injunction, corporations invoke anti-SLAPP to delay the case by 1.5 years. From there, Senator Badalori tells you, delayed cases inevitably get thrown out. Senator Guo is exactly right. The defendants are winning. Here's the issue. The defendant is the large corporation. That's the inherent downfall of today's solvency in Section 2. Its protections are just too sweeping. There's no differentiation between protecting fact-checking small NGOs and bailing out large corporations. But at the end of the day, that has a real human impact. Let's outweigh Senator Ortiz and Rousey by scope, and flip Senator Harrigan's impact on big media. When nonprofit injunctions don't hold big corporations accountable, mainly big media, no one can. A study from Nature Scientific Report Journal on April 22nd of 2022 finds decreased NGO injunctions on big media leads to a 6.9% increase in vaccine hesitancy. That's more pronounced in minority communities, Senator Ralphie, and the rural communities where I grew up. On Capitol Hill, we have unpaid interns, handsomely paid lobbyists, and the best doctors in the nation to tell us the truth. But from the Rust Belt in America to these small farms on the frontier, Americans only have the Sunday show.
Thank you for the speech for 4 minutes and 4 seconds. All questioners, please rise. Please step aside so I can make sure I can see everyone there. That would be very appreciated. Between those standing, that first seat will go to Senator Paul Ortiz.
Hey, so let's look at your earlier example. Who has the truth, the fact checker or the large company?
The investigative journalist.
So how is that defamation?
Because the protection the large corporation has under the anti-SLAPP law still applies, because its protections in Section 2 solvency still apply to defamation.
But if it's truth, then doesn't that mean it's not even defamation in the first place?
Right, but right now, even though it is defamation, they're still hiding behind the clause.
But you just said it's not defamation, so it doesn't apply.
Because Section 2's clause protects defamation.
No, but judges can dismiss the case if it's not real. And if you find it's truth...
I'm a little confused. If corporations are the defendants now, why is it not still true that defendants have the initial burden of proof?
They do have the burden of proof.
Yes, they have now the status quo is they have the initial burden of proof. So if you don't want big corporations winning, they still have to substantiate their claims, right? In either world, it becomes harder for them to win frivolous lawsuits.
It's very easy to substantiate a very small claim at the beginning of litigation than to actually go to court. The issue is that we're delaying the cases and we're getting thrown out.
The Speaker of the Question may be seated. Senator Tieringer, is that a motion?
No, sorry. It's not.
Senator Rye, is that a motion? Okay. If I have not called on speakers yet, please don't raise your placard. You can just lower. Thank you. Seeing no speech in negation, we're now in line for a speech in the affirmative. All affirmative speakers, please rise. Between those standing off of randomness, Senator Tieringer.
All right. Okay.
That's Senator Derringer, spelled D-I-E-R-I-N-G-E-R. First time this legislative session. Judges Pio Carly, I'm just going to assume you're ready. If you're not, please give me a call. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of one of the greatest victories in the history of American investigative journalism. On April 29, 1974, President Richard Nixon was forced to release tapes that proved his involvement in the Watergate scandal, proving his guilt, shining a light on his presidency to the American people, and saving our democracy. Our freedom only survived because of a free press, because of the tireless efforts of investigative journalists Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward to expose Nixon and his scandal. But in today's world, the rich and the powerful are crushing that same free press, and by extension, crushing our freedom and our democracy. Pass this legislation because it saves investigative journalism from decline. Now, first and foremost, Senators McEwen, Huckabee, and Horn tell me two basic facts that I think define this entire debate. One, investigative journalists are in dire straits financially. True. Secondly, investigative journalists lose a lot of slap lawsuits. Also true. But when you connect the dots, you realize that the affirmation is the only path forward. Because the reason journalists lose lawsuits is because they can't afford good representation. The Association of Independents in Media writes in 2022 that since the 2000s, most media companies have stopped paying the legal fees of their journalists and forced journalists to hire their own legal representation because it's cheaper for them to lose journalists than lose 6 figures in legal fees. That's why journalists lose, Senator Ewan. They lose because they can't afford good representation. That's why Northwestern University writes on December 3rd, 2023, that journalists independently get sued 6 times as often in slap lawsuits as publishing companies. Plaintiffs go after independent journalists because they know they can't afford good representation. This legislation enables them to afford good representation because when companies believe their journalists will prevail, they're more likely to pay their legal costs. And when journalists receive financial compensation under Section 1, they can afford to hire better lawyers and they can afford to fight harder. The American Bar Association writes in 2024 that they found journalists win slap lawsuits nearly twice as often when they don't have to pay for their own legal representation or get reimbursed under anti-slap laws. That's why this legislation is so critical. I listened to Senators Huckabee, McEwen, and the rest of the negation come up here and tell me that legal fees stop journalists from surviving. Senators, that's the status quo. Journalists lose because they can't afford good representation. This legislation enables them to get that representation. But why does that even matter? The American Journalism Freedom Project writes in 2021 that some 81% of investigative journalists wrote that after slap lawsuits, paying down the cost of their legal representation forced them to stop writing stories and stop focusing on the news. That means that we're missing out on hundreds or thousands of investigative journalist reports that can help our democracy, save us taxpayer money, and move us forward. All because journalists can't afford good representation. But the second reason you pass this legislation is to help journalists in our most underserved areas. Now, Senator Horn tells you correctly that 79% of Americans live in one of the 33 states with an anti-slap law. The problem is that the remaining 17 states are among our most rural and neglected states because they don't have the same number of investigative journalists. The Overland Review writes on April 26, 2024, that most of the states without anti-slap laws see a more hostile environment for investigative journalists that encourages freelance reporters to move elsewhere and stop working for newspapers in those states. That's why the Stanford School of Business writes on September 8, 2021, that as slap lawsuits rose in the 2000s and 2010s, small-town newspapers saw a 57% reduction in the number of investigative journalists on hand. When you expand slap protections to our most neglected states, you enable investigative journalists to stay where journalists aren't already. And that matters because when small towns can also afford investigative journalists, small town taxpayers save time, money, and resources. The Global Investigative Journalism Network writes that small town reporters have saved billions of dollars in taxpayer money. Pass this legislation so our history is full of reporters, not Nixons.
Thank you for the speech of 4 minutes. Any second question, please rise. Sir, no one unopposed.
Doesn't this legislation just let defendants recuperate costs as opposed to getting more money?
Yes, it enables them to recuperate costs, but that means the defendants, when they believe they're going to win, that makes publishers and defendants more likely to hire better, more expensive representation.
If you're recuperating the costs lost in the beginning, how are you getting net money to pay for a new lawyer?
You're not necessarily getting net money, but...
How are you paying for a new lawyer?
Yeah, you're paying down your legal fees, you're paying down the cost of fighting, you're paying down all of the costs.
How are you paying that if you told me they couldn't pay it before?
They can't pay it now because they don't have protections. If you're not
Hi. If these small journalists are now paying for more expensive representation because they believe they'll be compensated after they win, but then they lose the anti-slap lawsuit, aren't they going to now be left spiraling into debt because they paid for something they couldn't afford?
Okay. I didn't tell you that journalists are going to win 100% of the time. That's
right, but you told me they're going to pay for stuff they can't afford.
I told you they win twice as often, which means that publishers and companies are more willing to pay their legal fees.
Okay, fine. Either way, publishers are still going to be paying for something they can't afford.
Except they now can because they
Thank you. With that, the speaker in question may be seated.
Just a quick point of order, I think Senator Horn isn't blocked out from the speaker, but you did give a speech. I just want to make sure it gets space other than.
Yes, because that was directly before we did transition from one speech to another. It still does not impact how I call on it because I look at that column first.
Yeah, no, but I just want to make sure.
Seeing as I was speaking affirmative, we're now likely speaking negative. All negative speakers, please rise. Once again, all negative speakers, please rise. Sir Bhattacharya, unopposed.
I think the chair. For the chamber's reference, that's Representative Bhattacharya, spelled Bhattacharya. It's probably the longest name on your ballot. So there's a lot of judges here, so please just let me know if you're not ready. Awesome. Also, just a quick trigger warning to the chamber. I will be talking about topics related to sexual assault, so I'll give you guys a few minutes to leave the room. A few seconds. Okay, perfect. In the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy didn't need evidence to ruin lives. The only thing he needed was accusations. Careers were shattered and reputations were destroyed just because someone ignored due process in the name of freedom. Stop voting for the people who always hurt the most. Fail today's legislation. Throughout today's debate, we've only operated under one impasse, that David is the defendant and Goliath is the plaintiff. I want to be the first person to look at situations where David is the plaintiff and prove why they are the people who are always forgotten when you pass today's legislation. First, let's look at the most vulnerable people in the court system right now, survivors of sexual assault. In this world, survivors are suing people for their assaulter. And that's dangerous because in this case, BD law in 2024 tells us that defendants can file anti-SLAPP lawsuits against the people who are trying to go against the people. Here's why that's so dangerous. According to Trial International 2020, most sexual assault cases are one of the hardest to prove in court. There are two reasons for this. First, the same source tells us that sexual assault cases are one of the hardest to prove because evidence is so hard to find. Representative Guo and Paul Ortiz, for most people who can barely prove it in the first place, when you pass this legislation, it becomes so much more dangerous because the Institute of Free Speech tells us that when anti-SLAPP lawsuits go into place, the burden of proof of the plaintiff goes up because now you have to prove that the anti-SLAPP lawsuit isn't enough. So when you're already struggling to prove that you are valid of your assault, you're standing there, you're asking for more evidence. That's not only unfair, that is cruel. When you pass this legislation, Representative Bhattacharya, I will never claim to protect the First Amendment if we are silencing the very people who our court system go against. Second, jurors tend to have preconceived bias against these cases in the first place. According to Science Direct, jurors that hold stereotypical attitudes towards sexual assault cases are more likely to judge defendants as not guilty. So let's clear this up. What Representative Paul Ortiz's bill does is take the cases with the most stigma behind them, make them increase the burden of proof, and put them in a courtroom where these same jurors that are supposed to decide if you are innocent and guilty already think you're not valid. That is so important because here's the round-willing analysis. The psychiatric advisory in 2020 tells us that victims after a failed case are more likely to experience increased anxiety, increased depression, and increased PTSD. We live in the United States of America. We're supposed to promise our people a right to a free trial. When you pass today's legislation, the only thing that you are telling them is that they don't deserve it because we don't give it to them. Remember, protect the most vulnerable first before you ever make a claim. When Representative Duntal tells you that there are so many other cases where the defendant is innocent, where the defendant is guilty, and the fact that anti-SLAPP lawsuits are going against the people who genuinely need justice in the system, there is never a reason why you should be voting against them. Because our system was meant to protect the people and serve those who protect everyone. Right now, you are punishing the people who deserve most. At the end of the day, I was able to prove to you that there are people who anti-SLAPP lawsuits go against. When you pass this legislation, the only thing you do is tell them that they never deserve justice in a system where we promised them hope. Representative John McCarthy was able to come up here and tell people that they were a victim, where they were guilty, even though they're not. When you pass this legislation, we are just as bad as him, because we tell them that they don't deserve it. Please, fail today's legislation.
Thank you for the speech of exactly 4 minutes. All questions please rise. Between those standing, that firstly will go to Senator, apologies, that first goes Senator Raufi.
Hi, Senator. What's the purpose of a burden of proof?
To prove if they're guilty or not.
No, it's to ensure that there's a valid legal claim to see if you can go to court, not if you're guilty. If that's the case, what's the harm of enforcing that there's a burden of proof?
Okay, so the harm of it is that right now, when you have an anti-SLAPP lawsuit filed against you, the very first thing that you should do is now prove that you're
Right.
actually right.
All you have to do is prove that there's a case to be had, not that you're right.
I'm telling you that in my world, there's less evidence
Why
that
is
you
it
get a
bad?
court through.
Why is it bad to ensure that you have a valid claim to go to
The most
court?
vulnerable people in America can't have that evidence. Right now, the court system protects them.
Great speech. So it's pretty hard to prove a sexual abuse verdict, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we pass, wouldn't the judicial system just adapt?
No,
Why?
because I told you that our judicial system is inherently against people.
Our judicial system is inherently
Yeah, I
against
told you
people.
how jurors go into situations with preconceived biases. That's literally
Is it
specifically
jurors
against
or
that.
the judge deciding the burden of proof?
It's the judge.
Okay, so jurors are irrelevant.
No,
Then why can't the judge adapt?
Thank you. With that, the speaker in question may be seated. Turn their seat. Is that a motion for us? Seeing no speech in engagement, we're now on for an affirmative speech. All affirmative speakers, please rise. Start right off right in this. I think the chair. Hi everyone. That's Senator Rai, spelled R-A-I, speaking for the first time today. I'll just assume all of you are ready unless I get told otherwise. I'm really excited for your speech. Yeah. I need a minute, hold on. Last night, as part of my nightly binge-watching session of Netflix, Center Theater, one thing came across my Netflix For You page and I just couldn't resist. How to be a dictator. And as a power-hungry congressman, it was a temptation I couldn't pass up. But the first few episodes were pretty boring. Episode 1 was about military coups, episode 2 was about killing your opponents, but for me, episode 4 was the most important. Control the truth. Because if you can control who gets to speak out and what version of the truth is told, you can control everything. Real life in the United States should not turn into a horror show. Pass this legislation to make sure every single person can tell their truth. Towards the end of this debate, I think whether you vote for the affirmative or negative has come down to two fundamental issues. First, is the cost of litigation being met by this legislation in a way where people can actually fight for their rights? And secondarily, do legal proceedings actually benefit the innocent? Senator Nguyen and Huckleberry started off this debate by telling you the cost of litigation, the cost of asking for dismissal, the cost of these proceedings is the reason why this legislation fails. They tell you, because it doesn't cover the cost of asking for a dismissal, this legislation fails. Please, read the bill before you choose to fail it. Under Section 1B, you can file for additional damages. That means, Senator Huckleberry, that means that the people who is filing the SLAPP suit against you, you can get additional charges from them to cover the cost of the motion. You can cover the cost of any legal proceedings. Why? Because those are costs you incurred because of that trial. Section 1B means every single cost, whether it's directly related to the trial, whether it's filing the motion, if it has anything to do with this proceeding, you can get your money back. I think that's important for a couple of key reasons. First, Senator Nguyen and Huckleberry, this means that they can pay for all of your motions, meaning they can still get justice. But secondarily, Senator Nguyen, I disagree that they'll lengthen the trial. Think about it this way. If I extend the trial, the damages I'll have to pay in the end are a lot higher, because I would have cost the defendant that much more. This is a deterrent against people lodging SLAPP suits in the first place, because they know if they don't have enough evidence, they'll be paying more penalties under Section 1B. But then, Senator Bhattacharya, Song, and the rest of the negation, I'll give you a different version of the same argument. Without enough evidence, you cannot prove anything under this legislation, and therefore, justice is not served. Speaking of Suits, I think it's time all of us actually watch the TV show Suits, because I'm pretty sure Harvey Specter could answer this question. As the Institute for Justice explained on August 7th, 2023, discovery, shocker, is not the only way to get evidence in a courtroom. Like the negation conceded to me, in cross-examination, you can get a subpoena for free under this legislation, get that before the trial, and get the evidence you need.
But then Senator Horn tells you they still need a lawyer. Remember Section 1B. You can cover all those costs because you get additional charges. But then that begs the question, what is actually changing under this legislation? Senator Horn tells you states have a state-by-state basis of how this regulation is done. I think that it, on principle, is a bad thing. Where you live should not determine whether you get justice or not. Pass this legislation to make an equal standard for every American to get the same quality of justice. Because Section 1A and 1B make a clear proceeding in all 50 states that they have to follow the same procedure no matter where you live. At the very least, every American gets the same rights, the same entitlements, and the same treatment under this legislation. Under the affirmative world, that is the only case where people get their money back, get equal rights, and get what they deserve. We don't live in an autocracy. We live in a democracy. Protect that and affirm.
And for that speech of 4 minutes and 6 seconds, all questions please rise. Between those standing, that first goes to court on precedence.
Why do plaintiffs generally win slap lawsuits in places where there isn't anti-slap laws?
Because there's nothing stopping them.
It's because they have better attorneys. Does that change when you pass this legislation?
Not necessarily, but the defense gets better attorneys because they can finally pay for them.
Wait, so you're telling me they can pay for them? They can only pay for them if they prove that higher burden of proof. Why can they do that if they don't have good attorneys?
They can hire better attorneys. Senator Bearden proved to you they're 2 times more likely to win under this
They only get that if they prove a higher burden of proof.
I told you they can prove it because
if they don't have the attorneys to start,
it's all about words and now.
Hi, Senator. Those subpoenas and discovery are ordered by like a court and a judge, right?
Yes, but they can
Yes,
happen
right.
before
So if
trial.
you file a motion to dismiss before you get to court, how are you still here?
You can get the subpoena before you go to trial. I can ask for
But
evidence.
they can also file a motion to dismiss before the trial, and judges under most
You're arguing
circumstances accept that.
hypotheticals. I'm saying subpoenas are a standard.
No, I
everyone
mean
has.
legal analysis that says when you pass
I
law.
mean TV and real analysis that you can get a subpoena before trial.
No, but that only happens in the status quo. You pass.
That's not the same as
With that, when Speaker and the questioner may be seated, if minors keep decorum during questioning. Seeing no speech on the affirmative, we're now line for speech on the negation. All negative speakers, please rise. Once again, all negative speakers, state that.
1 minute and 2 seconds.
Who here still needs to speak on this bill who's speaking on the negation period? Nobody. Okay, so per TOC rules, it explicitly bans us from, this means that either just one person would have to flip in order for everybody to have this. Is everyone else on the affirmative? Senator Moon, are you on the affirmative? So quickly, this gives us 3 options. We could either table it, come back to it, or move into our 10-minute recess now, giving us 10 minutes for people to flip, meaning that people unilaterally move into debate on the next bill unless you all want another recess, or is anybody even here?
How do y'all feel about it? Like, the 3 of you that need to speak, what are you guys most comfortable doing to be like the best speech?
I mean, I've been writing for now for a while now, so I was like,
Same here, so we get. Both of them have been rising for a while. Great. With that, the recess has elapsed. Once again, I will call for any negation speeches. Sir John Tall, is that a negation speech?
Motion.
State that.
Motion for 1 minute and half recess.
30 seconds.
Do you want to just take the 10 minutes now and then?
That's what we did by Sunday.
Okay.
So yeah, it's up to them.
Can we figure out who's
It's up to them.
flipping now?
Could you three flip in 10 minutes? That's pretty. That's pretty.
What did you guys have?
Yeah, one.
I also, as a note, on page 2, Rule 14, we're not even able to adjourn it if not everyone gets 2 speeches. So, is anyone here?
But isn't the hard stop at 1:30?
But then we have to
No,
wait
but
till
that's like,
1:30.
we won't be able to adjourn before 1:30. So we have like an hour.
Yeah.
There are 30
I
seconds
think
left.
the dilemma is even if we take recess, somebody has to have a willingness to flip. Obviously, I don't want to pressure anyone to that. It's a conversation between the 3 of you, whatever you guys want to talk about.
That's a rough choice.
Is taking recess going to get us anywhere? Like, that's just a question. I get that.
Or would you guys rather just? Would you rather?
Motion.
Take that.
A motion for a 10-minute recess.
I second.
Any opposed? With that, we now move to a 10-minute recess. Please be back at 10:48.
Including spectators, if you are going to come back.
That the recess has elapsed. Have all judges returned? Yes. Just gonna wait to the parley, and then we will continue debate.
Just a reminder to the spectators, Earlier, we mentioned that whispering is audible. It continues to be audible. The acoustics of the room have not changed. And if you are talking back there, the people you are disturbing most are the judges, who are the people that need to be disturbed the least. So please, don't talk.
If you do have something come up, you need to chat or something like that, just please, in between speeches, excuse yourself. The hallway's great. There's coffee out in the pre-function area. We're not disrupting speech. Life is wonderful.
Just on a note, I haven't had an issue yet, but just to reiterate, right, if I can hear you practice your speech, that will be a problem, so please don't as other people are doing. Haven't heard it, so you're all good for now.
Great. With that, we now will continue debate on a bill regarding SLAP.
Just to clarify, we can break cycle now and then still have another debate.
Yes. It's just that it's prohibited to do 3 speeches in a row on a side, so to break twice, cycle twice. Seeing as that was an affirmative speech, I now will call on any negation speeches. Any negative speakers, please rise. Though the chair highly frowns upon a one-sided debate, especially in TOC finals, I will be forced to break cycle. Any affirmative speeches, please rise. Any affirmative speeches? Seeing as there are no speeches on either side, Sarah Park, you have the floor.
Sorry about those little hiccups, but Senator Park for your ballot, pretty simple to spell. If it's easier for you, it's the only 4-letter name that starts with a P. We have a pretty large panel today, so please tell me if you're not ready. All right. Justice only means something if it's accessible to everyone. Yet our federal lack of anti-SLAP protections makes that not reality. Truth tellers in the status quo are left to fend for themselves based on nothing but chance and where they live. Equalized protection for every jurisdiction. Pass today's policy. I think at the end of this debate, every single negation senator, with the exceptions of Senator Horn and Nguyen, have all talked about a singular concern. Legislative ineffectiveness in the court of law will increase costs on our constituents. I do not agree on this argument on a principled, pragmatic, and logical perspective. Let's look at it in the best case scenario. One, where none of my side's advocacy stands and their arguments all exist. I think we forgot what the sponsor of our legislation, Senator Paul Ortiz, explicitly explained. This is policy in 35 states in America. The burden of proof on the negation is not to prove that this policy is bad. We understand. We as legislators do not make perfect policies. That isn't our job. But they have to prove that policy that works in 70% of America under a federal statute is so bad that in the 15 states where it doesn't exist, it causes that negative harm. Don't consider their advocacy unless you find it in your ballot to believe it under that question. But let's look at it in the worst case scenario, when our side's advocacy from Senator Raufi to Paul Ortiz still stands, and a case gets dismissed under SLAP statutes. Senator Song and Nguyen, the very fact that a case cannot materialize is what saves costs. My family has been sued by frivolous lawsuits. The price was not paid because the court case came to a decision. It came from the 3-hour-long attorney calls that my parents had to make. Those costs add up. It is $200 an hour for an average American to afford a decent attorney. $3 a minute. The price of these SLAP suits is not paid with decisions. It is paid in cold, hard cash. But let's go back to the exceptions. Senator Horn and Nguyen, who've talked about how corporations are going to be able to manipulate today's legislation. I think it's high time my side answers the burden of proof. Why the 21% of jurisdictions that do not have these protections? I don't know about you, but I think companies and malicious actors in the status quo understand where that 21% of non-protected jurisdictions are. They manipulate that in the status quo by jurisdiction hopping to get these SLAPP suits in place. The American Bar Association explains in March 16th of 2022 that because multiple states and this government does not have anti-SLAPP protections, bad actors get those SLAPP suits in the jurisdictions. This isn't theory. Both situations have happened before. In the 11th Federal Circuit Court, the case Carbone v. Cable News Network in 2018 literally nullified Georgia's anti-SLAPP suit protections. This very exception exists in the 5th, 10th, 7th, and DC appellate courts. These government and these bad actors already utilize that loophole. But Time Magazine further explains on March 21st of 2025 that in the court case Energy Transfer LP versus Greenpeace USA in 2016, a federal case that got dismissed for frivolous actions got refiled in North Dakota for the simple fact that they did not have SLAPP protections. Senator Nguyen, Senator Horn, the very fact that this legislation does not exist federally is the very reason why Americans in the status quo can't speak their piece. Please affirm.
Thank you for the speech in 4 minutes and 3 seconds. All questioners, please rise. Unopposed or solid?
Hey, Senator, you say it's a success in 35 states.
It is.
Right, so and how is it a success when you don't give plaintiffs any opportunity to even get facts, let alone go to court?
Two simple responses. Subpoenas exist, which are pretrial motions. Second,
but subpoenas also you have to prove a burden of
that's where my second response comes to play. The second response is the simple fact that if someone's defamation lawsuit is valid, they have the evidence before the suit is filed.
To gather evidence, they need to be able to go to.
You do not need to gather evidence if you've been defamed. It just exists.
Sworn off recency.
How does the jurisdiction for any court get decided?
I mean, where it's filed. Under which jurisdiction, where it's happening, where the situations happen.
Okay, it's based off where the situations happen, right? So how can a company just hop over to another jurisdiction if the
It
law
happened
is
in
broken
Greenpeace
in
versus
one
Risk.
state?
It happened in Greenpeace LP
I'm
versus
really glad you gave one example, but generally,
if it happened once, I don't want injustice to happen again. It's a loophole that companies exploit.
Your side has been telling us that anti-SLAPP laws work. Clearly, they're not jumping to other jurisdictions.
They don't work in the jurisdictions where they don't exist. Ask federal protections.
With that, the speaker from the question may be seated. Seeing as an affirmative, I think the chair thanks you. Seeing as an affirmative speech, we're down line for negative speech. All negative speakers, please rise. Quasi unopposed.
I thank the chair. Thank you and good morning. My name is Senator Quasi, spelled Quazi, speaking for the first time in this session. I'll wait for spectators. Just let me know if you're not ready or else I'll be happy to begin.
Maybe I'm just hearing things, but please silence all of your devices if you are a participant, spectator. I mean, judges, I'm sure you're probably fine, but regardless of who you are.
It was me.
Okay, well, either way, sorry. Sounds good anyways. Thanks.
Once all of my judges are good and their fingers are good, I'm ready to go. All right, we'll look straight. The other day, I took one of my greatest lessons from my role model, General Aladdin, about how to be a suppressor and controller within any country or regime. He taught me that the person who is able to control the freedom of speech and press is the one who controls all people's rights. It's because today's legislation changes a slap on the wrist to a slap on the face for our judicial system. All of us must fail. At the end of today's debate, the entirety of the affirmation, from Senator Baudelaire all the way to Senator Harriet, have given you an undifferentiated version of one same argument. Financial compensation under today's legislation finally gives defendants a chance at justice in SLAPP cases. 5 layers of analysis here. First, Senator Raoufian Baudelaire, his argument about giving them an opportunity for motions pre-trial is non-unique. The Duke Journal of Law found in 2020 that already in the status quo, 80% of defendants in SLAPP lawsuits attempt to either file for a motion to dismiss pre-trial, or also try to prove that the other side's prosecution claims are baseless. Today's legislation demands that they have to prove that prosecutors have baseless claims, but defendants are already doing that. The affirmation has failed to prove how today's legislation uniquely empowers defendants to win more cases. All it gives them is financial compensation. That doesn't change how the justice system works at all. But second, I think this argument is in need of critical weighing. Flash back to Senator Warren's argument about how anti-SLAPP lawsuits are already working in the status quo. What does that mean? That means in today's legislation, in the best case scenario, there may be a little bit more cases where defendants have a chance at beating prosecution. But flashback to Senator Dalton's argument. He already proved to you that large corporations can use this legislation as a shield against public criticism. Take a simple scenario. If any corporation uses defamation, talks bad about any other corporation, or fights down any civilian's rights, they can use this legislation as defense against prosecutors. That argument significantly outweighs any minute benefit of maybe more defendants winning a case, even though I don't even buy that argument in the first place. Third, and finally, we can see in today's debate that Senator Wynn proved an argument that I feel like no one has responded to in the first place, and that's the fact that costs are never saved because corporations always have other loopholes to actually exploit these defendants. He cites the Lanham Act, he also cites Copyright Act. The only response from the affirmation has been from Senator Bottiglieri, saying that defendants may have a chance to file pre-motion and they don't have to worry about paying those costs in the first place. But where are they getting this money? Nowhere in this legislation does it give defendants money to fight these cases. It gives them compensation after the case occurs. Is this really affordable for Americans? Don't just ask yourselves. Look towards the evidence. The American Civil Liberties Association finds on November 3rd of 2024 that the average defamation case that is drawn out costs nearly $100,000. No one can afford that, even if they're compensated after the fact. People will not be active. People will not use free speech, and this legislation won't empower anyone to make it through the system. It oppresses the marginalized. It continues to allow our system to fall apart, and there is no accountability across any cycle of today's debate. Fifth and lastly, even if every single affirmation argument doesn't really make sense in today's debate, why are we necessarily failing? It's because of Senator Dontal's argument about protecting corporations. The NYU School of Law finds in 2020 that anti-SLAPP lawsuits in EU and California were actually abused by corporations to protect themselves in cases of defamation. If corporations are able to use SLAPP laws like this legislation to protect themselves in public criticism, that problem only gets worse, turning Senator Ralphie's argument about corporations having corruption. There's no accountability measures if you're only changing the financial incentive. Fail this legislation.
Thank you for that speech in 4 minutes and 6 seconds. All questions, please rise. Speaker standing, Park offers seat.
Would a person suing a company for defamation have a valid defamation lawsuit?
Not always.
In most scenarios, in these situations, they do. How does the SLAPP clause stand in court?
I mean, if I'm taking the affirmation to the highest ground, you guys say that SLAPP helps defendants, let me explain.
Yeah,
it helps
sure.
defendants win more, right? That's the entire affirmation's argument.
No, it's not winning more. It's about not bringing the case to court in general.
So then you're just agreeing that the ass impacts don't really pan out.
The impact is there not being a case that saves America's
I
money.
already proved to you that this legislation does not
Very not precedents.
Hi, so your only net harm here was that companies use anti-SLAPP laws to exploit the system.
Yeah.
Can you explain how that works?
Well, if they have SLAPP laws, they can claim in cases of defamation that they didn't defame anyone and use SLAPP as a shield for
I don't understand. How would you sue someone for
this is
on
the
the
entire,
basis of a SLAPP
Yeah,
lawsuit?
this is the entire affirmation's argument, right? Like you guys are saying defendants are more likely to win if you pass this bill. That includes
If
corporations.
those companies have no basis, the case doesn't stand in court.
The imperfections of the legal system claim even on the affirmation.
Thank you. With that, let's take the question and be seated. Seeing no one to speak on negation, we're now line for speech on the affirmative. All affirmative speakers, please rise. I will unopposed. As a note to the chamber, seeing this is my 8th speech presiding, it will also be my final one before I hand it off to the parliamentarians.
All right. Hey everyone, I'm Senator Amu, speaking for the first time today and the last time on this bill. Judges, just let me know when you're ready. Yeah? All right. In 1960, the New York Times was sued for defamation. Their crime? For publishing an ad that criticized police brutality against civil rights activists. Now, that case became a landmark in First Amendment law. 60 years later, the threat of lawsuit is still being used to silence the truth. Please, don't continue this century-long injustice. Give your people a voice. Now, the biggest negation arguments centered by Senator Nguyen and Warren tell us two things. First, this bill doesn't really impact big corporations that much because they'll still have the funds to go to court. And second, Senator Horn tells us smaller plaintiffs with good faith cases are hurt because they just won't have the evidence early on. First off, Senator Nguyen, I would always prefer a world where big companies are forced to be put forth in the face of justice. Northwestern wrote in 2023, 80% of SLAPP lawsuits end in settlements due to intimidation and lengthy litigation. Senator Nguyen and Quasi, if big corporations are now forced to go to court, sure, they have the funds to continue fighting, but under today's legislation, so will the average citizen. Senator Nguyen, you said in your speech that if gone to court, these companies would probably lose. And now under this legislation, Americans are compensated for their time and troubles, plus they get the reward for winning. Senator Nguyen, that's how they make their money back. But second, onto the issue of evidence. Senator Horn and Nguyen tell us it is impossible to get evidence early on. One response, everyone on the negation needs to understand this bill only applies to defendants in action involving public petition. Now, if you're confused on what that means, Section 2 defines public petition as communication that occurs in a place open to the public. Senator Horn, it is so much easier to acquire evidence when the incident happens in a place open to the public or in a public forum. Princeton University research article wrote in 2022, cases where the incident took place in a public setting had 19% more evidence presented in trial. Why? Senator Bhattacharya and Dalal, defamation and harassment that happens in a public setting always has more eyes and more ears. That means more witnesses. That's the substantial basis Senator Horn asks for. And Senator Song, when the evidence is more accessible, defendants don't have to spend as much money hiring private investigators. This is the most holistic warranting of today's round. Every negation speaker's argument relies on the incident occurring in a situation where evidence isn't accessible. But again, those aren't the cases today's legislation impacts. At the end of the day, we give the much-needed helping hand to our most vulnerable Americans. Why is this aid the reason you pass? Pace Environmental Law Review wrote in a meta-analysis of 975 cases. When Americans are able to afford legal costs, Senator Quasi, they won't be forced to settle as a result because they know in confidence they can fight for their justice. And as a result, they are 82% more likely to win or have their case dismissed. Because when you're not risking your savings, you can afford to stand up for your rights. At the end of the day, accessibility to justice is what this democracy is built off of. In 1964, the Supreme Court drew a line in the sand for freedom of speech. This Congress must do the same, because while the Constitution gives us the right to speak, this bill ensures we aren't punished for using it.
Thank you for that speech. 4 minutes and 1 second. All questions, please rise. Please step aside so we can see everyone. That'd be great. Domingo standing firstly off precedence, Senator Bhattacharya.
Hi. If I'm a journalist who claims a corporation is using shady tactics, does that count as a public forum?
That's a public forum.
Yeah.
No, today's legislation only impacts scenarios where it's open to the public.
Legislation word for word says public forum.
A public forum, it's in the name, it's open to the public.
Wait,
there
yeah,
are witnesses, there are eyes and ears.
If I'm a journalist publishing on a news source, that's a public forum, right? People can read it. How do I get more evidence from that?
Because it's open to the public, there's more
How's that
witnesses,
evidence?
there's more
Everyone's
eyes
reading.
and ears.
How-
You present evidence based on what happens in the setting.
Exactly.
Public setting, there's more evidence.
If you're like the average American, you know how to collect evidence and like use it in a court.
That's what the lawyer does.
Yeah, so you still like pay for lawyers.
That doesn't change if you pass or fail or not. You're still
Right
gonna
now,
have
you don't have to go through the extra step of applying for this college. When you apply for
The
this
issue
college,
is you're
you
trying
need
to
additional
frame
lawyers,
this,
all the
trying to
process that
frame this acquisition of evidence as a huge burden. I
I mean,
prove to
for
you
a lot of
it's
people,
not.
like, you have to pay for a lawyer. It's got
This
literally
legislation
$500 an hour.
only impacts incidents in a public setting. It's a lot easier to get evidence when it happens in a public setting.
Thank you. With that, when speaker in question may be seated, seeing as all speakers have spoken on this, as the chair, just for efficiency's sake, I'll unilaterally move to please question On final Bill A bill to discourage strategic lawsuits against public participation, which for everybody's reference can be found on page 12 of the link in my PO sheet. For the sake of equity of opportunity between presiding officers, the parliamentarian will be conducting the voting procedure. It has been such an honor to preside this round, especially my final TOC ever. And with that, I hand it over to the parliamentarian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Casey. I'm going to allow Senator Wheeler to start setting up as well while we go through the actual voting process. Since we're automatically moving to previous question, when all those in favor of passing this legislation, please raise your placards. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. When all those in negation, please raise your placards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Are there any abstentions? There should be none. All right, on a vote of 9 to 7 to 0, this bill passes. Congratulations to the sponsor. Now I'm going to pass it off to Senator Wheeler.
Hey everyone, it's Senator Wheeler. Just to be as fast as possible, my procedure is the exact same as Senator Mitchell, and my PO sheet URL is tinyurl.com/WheelerTOC. Let me know if you have any issues accessing it, but otherwise I'm going to go ahead and just continue on. In a second. tinyurl.com/WheelerTOC. Any issues? Any questions? Senator Rush.
I'm not sure. I believe Senator Casey just put some bill, but I was asked what this was for.
Senator Casey, do you have those?
Sure. That was an 8-5 split. Keep in mind there are 16 competitors in that round. That's only 13 total people. That does have a margin of subject to change of 3, but right now it's currently 8-5 and 5.
All right. Senator Quasi, 30 seconds.
Second. Sure.
All those in favor, raise your placards. The count is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All those in nay.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so recess has elapsed. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next piece of legislation, which is called the Pardon Reform Amendment. Are there any sponsors? Senator Hare, Yim, unopposed.
Hi, for the second and last time today, I'm Senator Harrigan. I'll begin with any communication with you. Following the United States Civil War, Confederate leader Jefferson Davis had his citizenship revoked under Reconstructionist policy. But over a century later, in 1978, President Carter posthumously pardoned him, granting him back his citizenship, calling it a symbolic act of healing to reunite this country. Now, over 4 decades later, this Congress must work to reunite our fractured nation by passing policy that repairs past wrongdoings and secures our collective future. Pass my amendment. Now, I'm going to spend the next 4 minutes going over the problem, the solution, and what unique impacts my amendment brings to our American people. First of all, what's the problem? Right now, the volume of presidential pardons is increasing at an exponential rate. In fact, the Pew Research Center found this February that former President Joe Biden granted more acts of clemency than any previous chief executive on record, pardoning over 4,200 individuals. What's worse is these pardons are becoming more political in nature. In fact, in December 2023, Washington Post investigations of all clemency acts during Trump's first term found that never before had a president used his constitutional clemency powers to free or forgive so many people that could be useful to his future political efforts. For instance, person charged or convicted for their role in the January 6th attack on our U.S. Capitol, even those convicted of violently assaulting police officers. My amendment seeks to mitigate this abuse of power by giving the power of the pardon to this Congress specifically. Section 1 says that both chambers will require a 2/3 majority to pass any pardon. You get two good things from that. First, you eliminate political pardons as a whole. Because usually, in the chambers of this Congress, there is not one party that holds 2/3 majority of every seat, which means that bipartisanship is necessary to pass any pardon in this country. That's good on its own, but what's more? People, my amendment restores the people's confidence in this legislature right now, because people aren't happy when pardons are political. In fact, a Washington Post/Ipsos survey found in February of this year that 83% of respondents were opposed to Trump's offer of clemency for violent offenders on January 6th. 83%, that's not purely Democratic or purely Republican. We have a bipartisan constituency in America that doesn't want to see so many political pardons happen. When you pass my legislation, I've already told you that stops happening. When that happens, we put more bipartisan talks in this Congress and increase the trust of the people in us. Because the Bipartisan Policy Center told us in August of 2021 that 2 out of every 3 voters in this country prefer that their member of Congress works towards bipartisan solutions to issues in this country. When you pass my amendment, you introduce bipartisanship to pardons that increases American trust in us.
Thank you, Senator, for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners rise. That's going to go to Senator Rye.
Congress has a responsibility to write laws, right?
Sure.
So why should we have the power to decide who gets to break them?
Arguably right now, pardons are uniquely political. When we pass my amendment, you end that kind of mitigates any kind of corruption.
Not
that's
all of
happening
us
right
all
now.
belong to a political party. Are we not all politicians?
Sure. That's why my amendment says that a 2/3 majority per chamber is required.
Right.
That eliminates all one-party favor.
Wait, how does it eliminate that? The politicians are still deciding who gets a pardon, but now they can be lobbied.
Sure. But the unique thing is that 2/3 of the seats are not held by one party. That forces bipartisan
Senator
conversation.
Let's talk about President Biden's pardons. What percent of his pardons were politically connected?
I'm sure you can tell me.
I mean, not more than half, right? Like,
Yeah.
it just logically makes sense. What are other pardons used for, aside from political and personal connection?
They're used for a lot of things. There was used for Nixon's pardon. There was used for a lot of things.
In Biden's case, what were they for?
You can tell
A
me.
majority were things like marijuana possession. People
Oh,
get
yeah, sure.
very extended sentences for minor crimes.
Sure.
Shouldn't we have the power to pardon those people so that
Were
they're
those
not?
marijuana crimes on the federal or state level?
They were on the federal level.
Senator Ryupi.
Point of order, that should go to Senator Butler.
Sorry, I didn't see you. Senator Butler.
I'm a little confused. Let's say I buy the fact that you need bipartisanship to
Yeah,
pass this.
that's gonna happen.
In what world does 2/3 of either house ever agree on anything?
That's what's so unique about this legislation, because it forces conversation between two
Yeah,
parties.
it forces conversation that goes nowhere. Never in the history of Congress
I would argue,
has 2/3 of anything.
I would argue we can strike up new solutions. Things like deals. Let's say we pardon 50 Republicans, we'll pardon 50
In the
Democrats.
225 years of Congress, this has never happened. What changes that today?
When we set up instructions, we
Senator
decide to
Almond.
make nothing
Yeah,
happen.
bouncing off that last line of questioning, when was the last time Congress reached a 2/3 consensus?
Arguably, the reason we're so polarized right now is because there is no incentive for conversation.
Wait,
When you
Congress's
pass my
incentive is to pass legislation that helps the people. That's their
Sure.
incentive.
And they have an incentive to pass pardons to healthy people.
But if they haven't done it in the past, why would they do it
We've
now?
never given them the power to pardon. We've never given ourselves the power to
They
pardon.
had the opportunity to reach a 2/3 consensus. They've never done it before. Why would they?
My
do it now?
amendment uniquely does that because it
Thank you,
forces
Senators. You may be seated.
Chair.
The chair thanks you. Negation speakers rise. Senator Huckabridge unopposed.
Thank you, Chair. That's Senator Huckabridge speaking for the second time in session. Judges, once again, it's a lot of you. I'm going to assume you're ready if you're not. Give me a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs down if you're not.
My favorite presidential tradition is the annual Thanksgiving turkey party. During it, the president spares a turkey from Thanksgiving dinner, sparing its life and showing mercy. Show mercy and spare lives. Fail this policy. The primary reason you fail is to protect death row inmates. This policy gets rid of a critical method that can save their lives. As USA Today writes in December of 2024, in the final days of the Biden presidency, he commuted the sentences of 37 death row inmates, giving them a life sentence instead of losing their lives. But why is that pardoning power over death row inmates specifically so important? It's because, as the Office of Justice Programs writes, death penalty is so dangerous because you can never be 100% sure in a courtroom. Whether it's inaccurate testimony or even bias among jury members. Put quite frankly, you can never be too sure when there is a human life on the line. And what's worse is that it's almost impossible to reverse a death row inmate once it happens, because the courts are so backlogged that the same source furthers, the only method to get clemency is through the presidential pardon. That power gets immediately taken away the moment you pass Senator Hannigan's policy. Because all it does is require that a 2/3 majority of this Congress approves the pardon. That can never happen when the Death Penalty Info Center writes that presidents like Clinton, Obama, and Biden regularly pardon sentences. But it's currently the Republican Party's mandate that they're against it. Right now, they control both of these houses, meaning pardons for death row inmates are never going to go through. That's so dangerous. You put innocent people and their lives on the line. As the Innocence Project in 2024 found a study that from 1973 to 2014, analyzing 200 death row inmates that lost their lives. 4% of them were later found to be innocent with further examination. Don't put innocent people in a position where they lose their lives and not give them a way out. Passing this policy does exactly that. But second, Senator Harrigan worried about the political weaponization that pardons can create. I would argue this policy protects political weaponization just as much as it harms it. Because the thing is, pardons can shield people from innocent partisan attacks. As the New Republic writes, that going into office, Trump created an enemies list with everyone he wanted to prosecute because they publicly went out against him. It's people like Liz Cheney and Anthony Fauci. But if they have nothing wrong, they have nothing to hide, there's nothing to be worried about, it's not the case. Just the threat of prosecution and the image damaging that can create can bend people to his will. But thankfully, pardons were able to stop that process. As Al Jazeera writes on January 2025, that before Trump got into office, Biden preemptively pardoned Liz Cheney, Anthony Fauci, and all the people on that enemies list. Senator Harrigan, pardoning power can affect and prevent political weaponization. When you have a 2/3 majority, the majority in Congress is never going to go against the will of the party. Those pardons can never come through. Make the affirmative throughout the entirety of today's debate prove that the political weaponization is uniquely better the moment you pass. Really, that's what today's debate should be coming down to. A comparison between the lives of inmates and political weaponization. Political weaponization doesn't uniquely change. The death row inmates will lose their lives if we don't. Show mercy and save lives. Negate this policy.
Speech time, 4 minutes, 8 seconds. Commissioners rise. That's going to go to Senator Derringer.
Hi.
Hi.
We want to prevent death row inmates from being killed, right?
Yes.
You told me today, right now, that the executive branch under President Trump isn't going to pardon them, right?
Yeah.
If Trump won't pardon them, shouldn't Congress take pardon power and save their lives?
I mean, the Congress won't be there.
We
The whole
are
point is that
Congress.
Presidents are much
We
more
are
likely to-
Congress. If the president, please let me finish. If the president's not going to take action, and we want to take action, shouldn't we take this opportunity?
Presidents circulate, so you'll have ones that are in favor and against. It's really
Why
almost
let death row
impossible
inmates
to ever
wait when
get
you can
2/3
solve
of
their
this Congress
like
ever
So let's look at your death row inmates.
Yeah.
When do, in the course of a president's term, when do most pardons occur?
At the end.
At the end.
Yes.
So doesn't that mean that a lot of death row inmates who are stuck. They're stuck until the very end of a president's term to get their pardon.
That's better than not getting a pardon whatsoever.
Okay, but right now, if we make it to Congress, doesn't that make it more of an active pardoning
No,
system?
because you can never get 2/3 of this Congress to agree on anything.
Okay.
Especially when the people in control are people that are like, their party mandate is literally against
So if I prove that we can, will you flip to the affirmation?
No, because you can't.
Okay.
Senator Warren, do federal pardons apply to federal or state crimes?
Federal.
Okay, so let's look at the 3 people who are currently on federal death row. Who are those people?
Tell me.
They're mass murderers and school shooters. Do you think those people are innocent?
Yes.
Why?
No, I don't think they're innocent. I think they still deserve a presidential pardon and a life sentence.
Really? You're gonna vote to give them a lesser sentence? That's
I
what
told you, even in like the worst cases,
Yeah.
there's always a period of ambiguity. No one should lose their
But we
lives
found them at the
over
scene.
that
Why is it
ambiguity. No one should
Senators
lose their
are
life
not
over
opposed.
the slightest chance of
What do
ambiguity.
congressmen talk about? What do congressmen talk about?
Like politics.
Yeah, politics, legislation, right? Mostly
Yeah.
you're supposed to legislate.
Yeah.
If they're talking about anything but legislation, can there be things out there that they can reach two-thirds of?
Rarely.
Like if you're talking about something that's
I
evil
told
or
you
right,
that
you can equate it as something
the
right.
current party that's in control of this party is literally against death penalty, like community.
They're against community
They're never
on
gonna agree to it.
legislation, but when you change the topic to
Why would
pardons,
it be
what is that?
different? The topic in the legislation.
Because
is
pardons
not
are
against it,
polarized
nothing's
as
gonna change.
legislation.
This specific policy is definitely
Thank you,
making it.
Senators. You may be seated.
Thank the chair.
The chair thanks you. Exit the chamber of exit. Affirmative speakers rise. Between Senator Guo and Senator Derringer, that's going to go to Senator Guo.
Thank you. I thank the chair. For the reference of the chamber and judges, that's Senator Guo, spelled G-U-O, back again for the second time. I'll just take a moment for my judges in the back. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. When it doesn't benefit me, I hate nepotism. But when it does benefit me, nepotism is my best friend. But I draw the line at nepotism within the walls of this Congress. It should be the most just and principled place in the country. But when one individual right now has the power to overturn that, I'm passing this resolution to transfer the pardoning power to this Congress. First, Senator Huckabee, you can't compare legislation backlog to pardons. Of course, Congress deliberates on legislations extensively because it touches the lives of every single person in this room and every single person out of it. But pardoning one person who's already shown change from when they were convicted isn't that dramatic of an impact. So that's why your comparison doesn't apply in this debate. But what you can compare with congressional pardons to under this legislation is other forms of symbolism that recognize people for their change. Just like the Congressional Gold Medal, it requires a 2/3 majority pass, exactly the same as Section 1 of this amendment. And according to the Congressional Award's own website, in just the 45 years it's been in place, this Congress has passed 5,200 gold medals. So Senator Huckabee, Amul, and Bonneville, this is the last time Congress has reached a 2/3 consensus. This is your past president. And Senator Wright, we're all political, but past president shows how we can overcome that and unite under symbolism. But then, other senators are also worried about backlog. For example, Huckabee again, who's worried about death inmates not getting through. But here's the thing. If pardoning was less focused on handpicking friends, as they are now, and as I will prove later in my speech, it'd be more on whether or not an individual is inherently good or bad, and whether they deserve a second chance. It'd be much easier and much faster to pardon people under those metrics, because over 230 years of precedent have said that. Presidents have had the power to pardon people under the Constitution for over 230 years. If this Congress now gets that power, we can reasonably assume this precedent that's been set for 230 years and pardon people based on who's been pardoned in the past. That means death row inmates that were pardoned under the Obama or Biden administration that Senator Huckabee mentioned in his speech will now be used as the same metric to pardon death row inmates in this Congress. Now that we take personal favors and personal feelings out of it, this Congress can reasonably pardon everyone. But that actually streamlines the pardoning process. But you don't need me to tell you why pardoning more people is good. The Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority tells us that pardoning erases barriers for housing options, certain jobs, and educational opportunities because a criminal record currently limits these barriers in the first place. power undermines democracy and the will of Americans. Senator Huckabee, listen closely. I'm going to meet your burden. Look at what my bro, Donald Trump over here, has been doing. Here's another example to add on to our sponsor. Back in 2017, Reuters details in December 2020 how George Soros, Trump's former election campaign manager, lied to the FBI about his communications with Russian top officials in this damage investigations into Russian interference in our elections. But do you think President LeBeau would have been confident enough to do all that if he didn't have to spread Donald Trump in office? He ended up being right to bet on that friendship because he left prison after just staying there for 12 days. I focused on Trump for this example, but the problem isn't just limited to him. It simply shows that no president should have the power to let their friends do as they please. By stripping the president of this power, we finally remove nepotism from within the walls of this
Senator, for
government.
that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds, questioners rise. Senator Roddy Repeat.
Hi, Senator. Is pardoning someone a symbol of recognition or an action?
It's an action, but
Then
what,
how can we
the
claim?
difference?
How can we claim it's a sign of symbolism if we're doing an action in the U.S.?
Okay, this is giving them a second chance. I'm saying that legislation is an action, and legislation is an action that has a broad
Senator,
impact. This doesn't have a
Senator,
broad
it's really easy for Congress to agree on things that don't result to anything. But if this is an action, how are 2/3 of Congress going to agree to it?
Giving congressional gold medals is an action of symbolism because it doesn't
Senator
impact that
Howard,
many people.
do Democrats and Republicans generally agree that community service is good?
I'd assume yes.
Right, but do they all agree that a marijuana addict shouldn't have life in prison?
No, not everyone agrees.
How is pardoning not political then?
Pardoning is not political because, as I stated in my speech, there's already a precedent set for this stuff.
But the president you cited, the Congressional Gold Medal, is about community service. How are issues like marijuana possession not inherently political?
Okay, you're talking about the Biden administration. Those are non-violent, and that sets a
Thank you,
precedent.
Senators. You may be seated.
Point of personal privilege.
Exit the chamber granted.
Much appreciated.
Negation speakers rise. That's going to go to Senator Roddy. Enter the chamber granted. Next time do it before speakers, but I know it's quick, so.
I thank the chair. Hello, everybody. That's Senator Raufi, spelled Raufi. I'll set it right over here next to Representative Natal's slide. I'll take silence as an invitation, so some are not. Jason Hernandez of McKinney, Texas, defines this debate. Back in 1998, when he was only 21 years old, he was sentenced to life for several nonviolent drug offenses. Under modern laws, he would have been given a second chance instead of being told that he would die in prison. President Obama recognized this and granted him clemency in 2011. Since then, Jason has started one of the biggest nonprofits in Texas, became the director of the Sentencing Project, and allowed dozens of other inmates just like him to get the same exact clemency. Is our society better now that he is walking free with us, or rather, if he were still behind bars? Negate this amendment because it gets rid of one of our only ways to deliver justice when something we did in the past was unjust. Senator Harry Yim and Go on the affirmation. They need to prove why other solutions, such as making it illegal for presidents to pardon members of their own administration or banning pardons for crimes related to corruption, aren't better alternatives. I'll prove that the negative impacts of this amendment require us to go right back to the drawing board. The University of North Carolina on Chapel Hill on November 1st of 2022 finds that President Biden pardoned 6,500 people convicted for simple possession of marijuana. Presidents from both sides of the ideological spectrum have embraced this tool as a way to make things right. The Vera Institute on January 15th of 2025 finds that there are thousands of people today in prison for things that aren't even illegal right now, but with a 2/3 vote in place, you need to convince hundreds of members of Congress just to support you. For reference, this Senate only took 339 votes all of the year of 2024.
To just match President's pardon on the singular day of December 12th of 2024, we'd have to increase our vote total by 1,199. Does anybody here think that we can keep that pace? Exactly. Unless you want the marijuana offenders to remain in prison, I don't think we should be the ones in charge. Passing this legislation makes it nearly impossible for us to fix our past mistakes, and makes it actually impossible to do so in a timely manner. Back in 1994, President Clinton passed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, often referred to as the Crime Act. Mass incarceration was incentivized in a manner that sent hundreds of thousands of African Americans to prison. Upon passing this legislation, those mistakes remain just that, mistakes. Keeping Americans locked up reaps intergenerational suffering. The Florida Atlantic University on February 16th of 2023 finds that children with a parent in prison or jail are 5 to 6 times more likely to become offenders themselves. We lock people up for non-violent drug offenses and take parents away from their children. Every single day that their parents remain locked up, their chances of finding themselves behind bars go up. An affirmation victory is our only chance at lowering those odds. For Jason Hernandez and everyone else who shares his story, we negate. Unless, of course, you believe that society is better with him behind bars.
Speech time, 4 minutes, 2 seconds, question 5. That's gonna go to Senator Arian.
Hey, how many congressmen right now support the decriminalization of marijuana? Like about 50%.
Right.
Right, so how hard would it be to get another 15%?
Okay, let's say Congress wanted to get all these people pardoned. In order to get a 2/3 vote for thousands of people, that would take all of our time. How can we dedicate all of our congressional time to one aspect of what we're supposed to do in Congress?
Is 2/3 not 66%?
Right, but that's for every single individual pardon. Thousands of people are locked up right now. Where are we going to find the time?
If 50% already supports it, all you need to do is convince.
How are we going to pardon thousands of people?
If Biden pardoned nonviolent drug offenders, and now we come to this Congress and we're discussing the pardon of another nonviolent drug offender, how are you reasonably going to negate that pardon?
Even if we passed that pardon,
Answer the question, yes.
Even if we passed that pardon, there are thousands of them. How can we dedicate all of our congressional time to pardoning the thousands?
So you're saying that one of them, at least one of them will go through, right? Answer the question,
Even
yes
if
or no, one of them will move through.
We wouldn't get to everyone.
And we don't get to everyone right now. At least we're streamlining
If
the
it's
process.
under one person, we can get to
You
most
may be
people.
seated. Enter the chamber granted. Affirmative speakers rise. That's gonna go to Senator Nguyen.
Thank you. For the final time, that's Senator Nguyen, spelled N-G-U-Y-E-N. Just one more now. We are the United States of America. But honestly, what do we stand united on? A 2024 Gallup poll tells us some of the answers. Number 1, Olympics. We love being patriots. Number 2, cats. What? But number 3, and more importantly, the fact that arguments and hate have turned this government into one of the most ineffective, unproductive, and one of the worst groups to have ever served in the history of our government. Unite our nation by ending one of the largest problems. First, already Senator Huckleberry Faruqi, Badalori, and Amu on cross-examination all tells you that Congress will never reach 2/3 majority. So if we place pardons on that principle, then we will never get pardons passed. But I think this is such an oversimplification. The reason why 2/3 is never achieved in Congress is because Congress doesn't talk about pardons. What does Congress talk about? They talk about legislation. Legislation is always polarized. There's always beliefs for why somebody goes affirmative or negative on the legislation. That's why we never go 2/3. But the moment you change the topic to pardons, things change. If we're talking about someone who deserves freedom after serving the community, if we're talking about helping people who are wrongfully convicted who cannot afford legal fees, that's something that isn't polarized. That's something everyone in this room can agree with. And if we're pardoning those people, that can achieve a 2/3 majority. Senator Rufi, if you and I can agree that Jason deserved a pardon, if everyone in this room agrees that Jason did deserve a pardon, he would get a pardon. Just because Congress may have not achieved 2/3 in the past doesn't mean they can't get 2/3 when we change the topic. That is the point of this legislation. By requiring 2/3, only polarized pardons get thrown out of the window, but the pardons that get support, the pardons that people truly believe in, the pardons that we agree is truly right, those are the ones that only exist. Senator Rufi, if all of us believe that mistakes deserve a pardon, we can't achieve 2/3. Now that we know good pardons stay on the affirmative world, what actually gets eliminated? Senator Harriet, it's not just about Trump. The whole issue of polarized pardons is a historical, systemic one. President Ford pardoned President Nixon, his former running mate after Watergate. President Bush pardoned American arms traffickers in Iran to protect Reagan's image. President Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, who was charged with 51 cases of tax fraud, but was also one of the largest donors to the Democratic Party. Who let presidents become Oprah? You get a pardon, you get a pardon. You don't. Presidents are excessively using pardons for their own influence, when it should only be used in extreme circumstances. This legislation gets better pardons. I want to bring in the proof that this round needs. AP News finds on May 24th of 2024, in Massachusetts, state pardons are given through an 8-member council and require 2/3. A lot like this bill. Over 8 years, we saw 15 pardons, but none of them proved to have any bias or political backing. Instead, pardons were given to those who had taken truly meaningful steps to improve their lives and their communities. Senator Huckabee, we didn't see no pardons. We saw just pardons. Why are those just pardons so important? AP News writes on January 23rd of 2025, January 6 rioters who have been pardoned literally said they would storm the Capitol again. Polarized pardons are emboldening extremism and making political violence the norm. And The Guardian writes on May 10th of 2023, in Ohio, a county commissioner was pardoned for taking bribes from carbon-emitting companies. In Missouri, a couple was pardoned for firing a gun at a racial justice march. And in Texas, a shooter was pardoned for killing a Black Lives Matter protester. A politician sells out his community. A couple threatens peaceful activists. A killer silences a movement, and all of them walk free. Why? Because of a political agenda? That is where our country is going. We need unity, because divided, we fall. But united, we stand together. Pass this policy.
Speech time 4 minutes, 7 seconds. Questioners rise. That's going to go to Senator Bhattacharya.
Hi, what do people go to jail for? Breaking the law. Who writes the laws?
Congress, but so it's not, that's too simple, right? Like, some people will break a law when there's external circumstances. For example, I'm stealing food, but my entire family is poor. I'm raising 10 children. Those are
Wait,
extreme
but
circumstances.
still, if in the first place passing the same law was controversial, how can we not expect a debate over the party?
Because when you have a simple policy, it doesn't take into account extreme factors. That's what
And
parties
Congress
are for.
is simple. They always try to go through other situations.
So let's pass this policy. Talk about it.
Senator Quasi.
You warned that Congress is more likely to agree on pardons, right?
Yeah.
What was the majority of President Biden's pardons?
He pardoned his son.
What's the majority of his pardons?
Biden was polarized as well. Like,
okay, that doesn't answer
half
the
the
question.
vote.
The majority were nonviolent drug offenders. How
Regardless, I think more people is better than just one person. Biden was an exception, right? We had Trump, we had Reagan, we had so many bad examples. Yeah. It's more better than.
But let's talk about that example. How divided is Congress on drugs?
They are divided, but that means our recent
Thank you,
over that
Senators.
part.
You may be seated. The chair thanks you. Negation speakers rise. Senator Almu unopposed.
Thank you, Chair. Everyone, that's Senator Almu speaking for the last time today.
I'll give this up.
You got internet issues.
Yeah.
In America, we often hear the phrase, if you do the crime, you gotta do the time. But honestly, our criminal justice system is a lot crueler than that. Because for many Americans, that time is endless. I'm asking you, take the time to fail today to protect Americans tomorrow. Now, I'm failing not because the presidential pardon system is perfect. It isn't. Abuse happens. But moving that power to Congress doesn't fix the problem, it only makes it worse. Now, in my next 4 minutes, I'm just going to clearly compare the two worlds this amendment asks us to choose between. One, where the president holds the power, imperfect but functional, and one where Congress holds the power, gridlocked and paralyzed. Now, I'm a numbers guy, so let's look at the trends. According to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, over the past 50 years, objectively speaking, more than 91% of presidential pardons involved low-level federal offenses. Senator Harry, these aren't people who are buddy-buddy with the president, but those who actually deserve clemency. In fact, politically charged pardons that are deemed abusive made up less than 9%. Again, I agree with the affirmation, abuse exists, but the trend lines are clear. It's an incredibly small minority. Most people who receive pardons are veterans, nonviolent offenders, and reformed citizens that deserve the second chance they were given. Now let's look at Congress's trends. Over the past 225 years, the bipartisan policy center reports Congress has achieved a 2/3 consensus on any topic less than 1% of the time. Polarization today, according to the Pew Research Center in 2020, is at its highest since the Civil War. Then Senator Nguyen tells us when Congress talks about pardons, we won't be polarized. That can't be further from the truth. Political ideals spill over. For example, when it comes to drug possession, Democrats are more willing to forgive than Republicans. Senator Nguyen, finding a middle ground is just as difficult as solving polarization. And as polarization deepens, the chance of a 2/3 consensus shrinks even further. I want to make something clear and simple for every representative. When the president holds pardoning power, abuse, though happens, is not the consistent trend we see. But when it comes to Congress, failure to cooperate is overwhelmingly the consistent tendency present. You know what's crazy? Statistically speaking, it is 15 times more likely that this Congress never reaches a 2/3 consensus than a president abusing the pardon power. That's just numbers, senators, and that's the reality this legislation would bring into existence. A system where pardons die not by corruption, but by discourse and delay. The price is immeasurable. According to the Brennan Center for Justice in 2022, people with convictions on record are 50% less likely to receive job opportunities no matter how much time has passed. Every year someone remains locked out of opportunity. It doesn't just punish them. It plants poverty into the lives of their children, their communities, and their futures. Not because they were broken beyond repair, but because we refuse to let them rebuild. To every representative in this chamber, I want you to remember, they're not criminals. They're not enemies. They're American citizens. Treat them as such.
Speech time 3 minutes, 59 seconds. Questioners rise. Let's go to Senator Don Paul.
Great speech.
Thank you.
What political disincentive would a Republican or a Democrat have in pardoning Jason Hernandez?
Again, that's the rare exception. I prove to you that the majority is low-level federal offenses, but even then, once you pass, Congress is still going to take a long time.
Why is Mitch McConnell going to deny a pardon to some marijuana owner? What's the political
Objectively
disincentive?
speaking, drug possession is a polarized topic. Republicans and Democrats are going to have different opinions. This is not something we have to debate.
Senator Derringer.
Hey.
Hi. So you told me the president can take a long time to ratify pardons, right?
No, I told you the Congress is going to take a very, very long time.
Okay, whatever. If a president decides that they don't want to pardon someone and they're in charge for 4 years, doesn't that guarantee that for 4 years someone doesn't get justice?
But objectively speaking,
Okay.
Congress is going to take longer.
Yeah, how often is Congress up for re-election, right?
Huh?
Congress gets reelected every 2 years,
It
right?
doesn't matter. I told you in the past 225 years,
But
the number of times we reached
please
a
let me
two-thirds
finish.
consensus was less
Yeah.
than 1%.
But still,
Thank you, Senator. You may be seated. The chair thanks you. Affirmative speakers rise. That will go to Senator Paul Ortiz.
I thank the chair. Again, this is Representative Pa Ortiz, PA-ORTIZ.
I'll give a sec for everyone to.
Yeah,
I'll give a sec.
And just any sign of hesitation.
The glue that holds every strong relationship together isn't money, it's not shared personality, and it's not even common interests. No, it's trust. Behind every relationship between two entities, trust is a deciding factor. Whether that's between the Neanderthals and the wolves, or between our PO, Representative Wheeler, and our parley there. No, trust is how their bond succeeds and prospers. Today, pass this legislation to finally restore American trust. Now, I think today's debate is actually quite simple, and it boils down to just one idea. Will Congress even pardon? Representatives Huckleberry, Raoumi, and Amu tell you that congressional gridlock will stop the wrongfully convicted and death row victims from getting a pardon fast enough. I have three responses here. The first is that this argument is fundamentally non-unique. Right now, Representative Huckleberry has to rely on the current president at any point in time to want to pardon those people. But if the president just decides that he doesn't want to, nobody gets a pardon. But secondly, even when presidents do pardon, it's not like it's 24/7 on-demand service. The Pew Research Center found in December 12th of 2024 that over 96% of President Biden's pardons came in the final year of his term. And that's a trend, that more and more pardons are occurring, mainly at the end of a 4-year term. If the president can pardon in bulk, there's no reason why Congress can't pardon in bulk either. When the face of this country takes the oath of office, they promise to serve, protect, and defend. But for the Americans unjustly on death row, they sit wondering every day if that president will keep to his promise. But I want to focus on and prove my third response over the course of the rest of my speech. Unlike almost everybody on my side, I actually want to concede to the negation that yes, Congress does have gridlock, and we won't agree over every single decision. But I want to turn that idea and actually argue that's a good thing when it comes to pardons. We talked a lot about the January 6th presidential pardons, but a poll from AP News the same day of Trump's pardons found that only 20% of Americans supported those pardons because he used it as a way to protect his supporters, regardless of the actual law. Watching presidents shield whomever they want through highly polarized and political issues forces millions of Americans to watch as their own values are betrayed by their leader. The Partnership for Public Service writes in April 1st of 2024 that trust in our government is at an all-time low, with less than 23% of adults saying they actually trust our government. 4 out of every 5 Americans don't trust our system. However, I never thought I'd actually say this, but that's where the power of congressional gridlock steps in. Let me use Representative Harrigan and Ewan's analysis of bipartisanship. By definition, Congress needs bipartisan support to get things done. When we require a 2/3 vote to pardon Americans, pardons are no longer a purely political move anymore. Political pardons won't be approved by either party in Congress, but the very pardons Representative Huckleberry wants to be expedited will be approved. Both parties understand that if there's a wrongful conviction, Americans deserve justice. According to the National Institute of Justice special report in December of 2023, Americans back justice for the innocent across party lines. Now, they get a check against abuse. But I think what matters most is that it goes beyond the pardons. Representative Amu, you talk about polarization. You might want to pay attention now. When Americans don't see pardons for controversial issues that they might disagree with, they instead see justice, given where it is owed, and they can believe in our system. As the UCLA School of Law found in September 2023, increased trust leads to higher civic engagement. People want to vote because now they know that their vote matters. They know the system wasn't rigged in favor of the one person in that one highest office. Restore that trust.
Speech time 4 minutes, 6 seconds. I'm going to give this. Okay. Questioners rise. Senator Amu.
Hey, Senator, do you know how many more Congress people you need to convince to create and reach this 2/3 consensus?
Sure, it's a lot of
The
people.
number is 78. Can you guarantee me we can convince all 78 of those Congress people to agree on one single issue?
Not all the time. Oh, I can't guarantee that. Well, you can't guarantee that the president will pardon people either.
Yeah, the president always pardons.
If you're going to guarantee that the president will pardon
one
someone,
president that hasn't pardoned someone.
I mean, in the past.
Okay, well, the chair will absorb the remaining time. Senator Huckabee.
What's more likely, a president pardon someone or 2/3 of responses?
Is going to be the president pardoning more. And the problem with that is that the president pardons people on the basis of controversial issues.
Okay,
When it's only Congress, they work together.
In some cases,
What?
is that not worth it to you?
And it really depends on the situation.
Why not?
But because in most cases, people don't agree with the pardon in the first place.
Situations that you agree.
I mean, for one, not everybody agrees with the death sentence.
Okay, but like, how do you envision anybody in this Congress ever agree with that? Like,
Well, we
live
represent our constituents.
Thank you, senators. You may be seated.
Whatever's privilege.
Exit the chamber granted. I believe. Oh, no, that is not any speeches. All right, negation speakers rise. That's going to go to Senator Bottluri.
The chair, Senator Bottluri spelled Bodduluri for the second time today. Can you please judges, I know there are a lot of y'all, if you're not ready, let me know. Cool. Who should decide who deserves forgiveness? If you think it's yourself, it's not just about who you choose to forgive. It's about who you're willing to fight for, plead for, and who you truly believe in. When you take forgiveness, it's about how far you're willing to go to win someone else the chance of a second chance. If you can't fight for forgiveness when it's hard, you're never willing to forgive at all. First off, I think it's important to note that when this amendment hands over the power of pardons to Congress, we don't just vote on them, we propose pardons ourselves. Now, I think Senator May already outlined that this is virtually impossible to get a 2/3 majority to agree, so pardons won't ever make it through Congress. But then Senator Gross says, well, you passed gold medals anyways. That's an apples to oranges comparison. Gold medals are not inherently political. But, Senator Nguyen, political pardons are because they have political implications when you're looking to reach out to a certain voter base. If the reason we can't get to 2/3 right now is because of those implications, that's still true in your world. Bail this amendment because it keeps bad pardons but gets rid of good ones. I make the case that this is a little bit deeper than just a 2/3 majority. Keep in mind, members of Congress have to do all of the legwork behind the scenes to get a pardon introduced, but also to get their colleagues to back it. I don't think many of us would be willing to fight for one person and get 300, 400 votes just for one person. The only way that really happens, think about it, is if they really, really cared about the person receiving it. So who are those people? You guessed it, it's friends and family. Think about it. Nothing else would be worth trading all that political capital and spending all of that energy fighting for. So, Senator Nguyen, don't be too excited. This is just saber-rattling about stopping presidents from pardoning their family and friends. With Congress, you will see the same thing happen, if not more. When affirmative speakers talk about the problem, I want you to remember they're part of it. Now, let's talk about this comparatively. We should prefer keeping the power with the president because even though they can sign self-interested pardons, they will also sign pardons that act as a legitimate and good faith check against the courts. Senator Harrigan and Guo's entire advocacy talks about Trump. I want to remind you, there exists a world and planet after Trump. But NPR explains that in his last term, he defended over 10 drug offenders and pardoned people that were serving life sentences or super long sentences for non-violent crimes. In other words, whereas members of Congress will exclusively support the bad kind of pardons, presidents empirically sign the good kind too. The Chicago Tribune noted that President Obama pardoned 330 non-violent drug offenders and 568 inmates on life sentences in his final act as POTUS. That's what happens when you stand up to the impacts of mass incarceration and things that you think are unjust. In an affirmative world, there won't be a congressperson that stands up for our Americans in the same way.
but Senator Harrington's entire side is only focused on politically motivated pardons. I think, fine, even if some rich and powerful elites get to pay their way out of jail or play their get out of jail free card, that is way better and more important because you still keep around good pardons. Senator Paul Ortiz, if letting a couple white-collar criminals and President Trump's cronies free is the price you have to pay to let hundreds of thousands of innocents out, I'll say that it's worth it. Failing this amendment means we still get to keep the transformative effects of good pardons, like returning reincarcerated Americans to their families. The National Academy of Science wrote in September of 2019, 360,000 non-violent drug offenders can't find jobs, housing, and it triples the chance they re-offend. It keeps them from their families for years and even decades. To save what is good, you have to stomach what is ugly. If you put this on perfection, we will never forgive again.
3 minutes and 10 seconds. Questioners rise. That's going to go to Senator Paul Ortiz.
Hey, so if people are innocent, why would nobody in Congress pardon them?
Wait, I think that this just is way too simple, right? People can still disagree about what a wrongful conviction is.
Okay, but so if people disagree about it, then why should you force one standard based by the president of what a wrongful conviction counts as?
What's more likely is the president actually is able to get them passed, right? Also, you know what? Let's put this in practice. Name me one person you care so much about, you will fight all of us on that.
I mean, my constituents.
Yeah, just name one of them. I want to see this in practice. It doesn't happen.
The president has a special exception to good pardons, right?
Yeah, and that's happened in every single presidency, right? You've always seen people pardon someone good.
Why do we not also have that very same incentive?
I think we have that same incentive, but when you might be a good person, but if you have to fight 300 of your colleagues, I just don't buy this. Wait, I want to see the same question as Senator Paul Ortiz. I want to see this happen in practice. Name one of your constituents you care so much about, you would convince 300 other people to fight for them.
The exact same thing. Yes, you fight us on policies.
No, because pardons don't require professional approval.
The chair thanks you.
All right, thank you, Senator Wheeler. Let's give him a round of applause. Last but not least, for our final 8 set of speeches, we are going to have Representative Kumar, Senator Kumar as our presiding officer.
Everyone, my name is Representative Kumar. I'm so excited to be with you for the final 1/4 of the session. Really quickly going over my procedures. In terms of timing, I have the same procedures as our past POs. With the 10-second grace period, I will narrow down all 10 seconds from 4 minutes to 4 minutes to 10 seconds. Please don't abuse this grace period. It is a grace period, not a grace period. When it comes to presidency and recency, my tiny URL is tinyurl.com/Kumar, TOC 2025. Kumar, TOC 2025. There's no spaces, caps lock shouldn't matter. Let me know if there's any issues getting that. For this round, I have been keeping recency on paper as well, and I will continue to, just to ensure there is no error. So if you see me drawing something on my pad, I promise you I'm not doodling. Finally, we're in the home stretch. We have 4 cycles left. You guys are amazing. You all got this, and I'm so excited to continue with your team. With this, I call the session back.
I didn't know we were live, so I thought we were still in session.
So we're looking for affirmation speakers. Speakers rise. Stop.
Hey everyone, this is Senator Daniel Song, S-O-N-G, speaking for the second and last time this legislative session, singing a song of praise for the affirmation. All my judges could just give me a thumbs up when you're ready. Okay. Just stop me if you're not ready. Stop me if you're not. Okay. Presidential pardons were first used by George Washington to pardon members of the Whiskey Rebellion protesting against higher taxes, and Thomas Jefferson to protect Americans who spoke out against the authoritarian Alien and Sedition Acts. Now under President Trump, Steve Stockton, a former Republican congressman from California who stole $1.2 million from charity to fund hot air balloons, got pardoned. Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who targeted immigrants and forced them to walk hours in the hot sun, got pardoned. And 1,600 January 6th rioters got pardoned. You're passing this legislation because the most important impact in today's debate is who is able to protect our democracy. Right now, we need to understand that President Trump has essentially created a situation where he can immunize anyone in his inner circle who is willing to break the law for him, and they can get away scot-free with no legal accountability whatsoever. The fact that there are 1,600 people in this country who are willing to kill and die for President Trump should terrify everyone in this room, precisely because there is nothing stopping them from doing what they did on January 6, 2021, the same on January 6, 2029. In fact, Brenton Balu, a former federal prosecutor who prosecuted January 6 defendants' rights for the New York Times on January of 2025, that essentially all of these people owe their freedom and everything they have to Donald Trump, so they have every reason and incentive to do whatever he wants. Think about it this way. If you're a crony of Donald Trump, you either break the law and you stop associating with the Trump administration and risk getting prosecuted, or no matter how illegal you know it is, you stick with Donald Trump all 4 years knowing that you will get a blanket pardon that immunizes you from all federal crimes no matter what you do. If you want to keep your own freedom, you have every incentive to break the law in favor of President Trump. Make no mistake, Senator Bottomley, there is no price I'm willing to pay to sell out our democracy. Nothing, from marijuana reform to death row inmates, matters if there is no free and fair election on January 6, 2029. That is the biggest impact in today's debate, because the rule of law is the fundamental principle that undergirds every single specific legislative policy or provision in this country. If we do not have the rule of law, nothing else matters, because there is no way to protect anyone from rioters and violent vigilantes set free by the president. But then, let me also prove how, when we increase the power of Congress to pardon, we actually reduce political polarization. Senator Wen started on this conversation by saying the marijuana offenses are actually less partisan when used by Congress instead of the president. Here's the empiric to back that up. A Gallup poll from November of 2023 found 51% of conservatives and 70% of Americans were in favor of legalizing marijuana nationwide. When we remove the power and spectacle of the presidency and push it down to Congress, where congressmen can have better local connections with their constituents, they are more able to engage on an emotional level and have better reasoned, less partisan discussion. At the very least, when you remove the threat of the president being the sole person who can decide who can break the law and who cannot, there is at least more discussion and respect for the rule of law. In fact, the Journal of Democracy quantifies in October of 2024 that the rule of law is empirically linked to a decrease of political violence and an increase in trust for the government. Every time someone receives a pardon by this Congress, the entire American nation will know that 2/3 of a bipartisan majority approved of this pardon, recognizing that these people deserve to be pardoned. For example, Jason Hernandez has done so much good for his community. I don't think Texans would say he deserves to spend life behind bars. I believe at least 2/3 of Americans in this country are decent, honest people who want to see people rewarded for doing good and punished for doing bad. That is precisely why I think we should have a bipartisan majority instead of one wannabe dictator who wants to upend the rule of law once and forever. Because once democracy is lost, it will never come back again. The slogan of the Washington Post is "Democracy dies in darkness." Look up at the lights in this room to make sure democracy never dies in our country.
Speech time 4 minutes, 9 seconds. Questioners rise.
I don't think that's a fair world. I don't like Congress will have conversations about partisans.
Why are you going to have conversations if nobody's going to put those things?
Congressmen lobby the president for parties all the time. That's a good business sense. But that doesn't change.
But now you need 2/3 majority, right? And that just never happens.
No, that can happen on a lot of legislation that the CARES Act during COVID.
It's maybe one time in 225 years.
The CARES Act during COVID was, yeah, it passed with an overwhelming majority to give economic aid to
Yeah,
Americans.
majority is not the same thing.
No, 2/3 majority. It was done by one vote.
Hi, Senator. Why don't we ban certain types of pardons?
Sure, but that's not the legislation we're debating. Like, if you want to
Right,
suppose
but
an amendment,
like,
that's...
why can't we ban pardons for people that rebel against the Capitol? Why are we just changing the process?
Right, the thing we're debating today is whether it's better to have the president of Congress
Your
pardon.
issue,
I'm saying the rule of law is the
Senator,
biggest issue.
your issue is who's getting pardoned. So why don't we just change who is allowed to instead of changing the process?
Congress can decide. Congress is a better arbiter of pardons than the president. Like, one person should not have the power
First
to
of all,
immunize
Congress has never
anyone
pardoned
who
anyone
wants.
for us to know that. But secondly, why don't we
Thank you, senators.
Motion. Point of personal privilege.
Take that.
Thanks, the chair.
Granted. Take that.
Point of personal privilege,
Take
is
that.
it?
Granted.
Point of personal privilege.
Take that.
Just gonna make a note real quick for competitors. Let's not have more than 3 people out. You're fine to go.
Thank you.
Moving forward, let's just try to avoid having somebody out. And then one more thing, I don't know if the judge is necessarily here, but I do see people at least talking in the back as spectators. Please be respectful to your judges, to the competitors that are up here. It's been a lot of work, all of your competitors, so you should know. Please allow the judges to pay attention to the round without being distracted.
Perfect. Negation speakers, rise. Rise.
I think it's shared. Hi everyone, I'm Representative Rai, spelled R-A-I, speaking for the second and last time today. I'll take silence as sign that you're ready. A genuine question for everyone in this room. What does justice mean to you? For about half of us, it's making sure that people did the wrong thing are put behind bars. For others, it's making sure that the people who did the right thing never reach that point. But for me, the true meaning of justice is to do right by the right people. Serve the people who actually put you in office and failed this legislation. Towards the end of this debate, I think we've come down to two fundamental issues. First, are pardons even realistic under this legislation? And secondarily, what model of justice is best served by your vote? On the issue of voting, I think the best argument comes from Senator Nguyen, who says, we can generally agree on right and wrong, innocent and guilty. These are issues not impacted by politics. He tells you because of those things, the good pardons stay and the bad pardons go. I have two fundamental reasons. Using the affirmation's own logic as to why this never happens. Listen to his own argument. We disagree over politics, we disagree over policies, that is why nothing happens. Correct me if I'm wrong. Justice and criminal justice are some of the biggest policy issues Congress ever addresses. We literally debated this on the last bill. Insofar as criminal justice is a political issue, your pardons will be political too. But secondarily, Representative Fotius tells you that a majority of Americans can agree on innocent and guilty because we will always support the innocent. Again, flip your pad back to the last debate. We were having a 1-hour argument over who is innocent and who is guilty. So long as you cannot make that determination, you will never reach a 2/3 majority. But I think this comes to the bigger issue because we have to take a step back. I think whether you vote for the affirmative or negative is based on what type of justice you prioritize. For the affirmative, for every single speaker, they prioritize keeping bad people behind bars, even if it means putting innocent people there too. For the negation, they have told you they prioritize keeping innocent people out of bars, even if it means letting the guilty walk too. I think the version of justice that you should prioritize does right by the right people. 3 key reasons. First, I agree in either world, you will have criminals behind bars, criminals outside of bars. But if the only way to get the right people who did nothing wrong outside of bars is failing this legislation, I think that is worth it. You have a greater responsibility to the people who did nothing wrong, rather than punishing the people who did it wrong. That means, I think protecting the innocent is more important than punishing the guilty. Insofar as you agree with me, you are still failing this legislation. But secondarily, I think we have to address the reason we're fighting corruption in the first place. Representative Guo put it best. We have to fight impunity, where the executive branch can just do whatever they want and benefit their own people. Correct me if I am wrong. Congress makes the laws. You should not have the power to decide who gets to break it too. This is just another version of the government taking power it shouldn't have, violating justice in a way which is bad, and hurting the whole point of democracy. And third and lastly, who do you serve? The whole point you fight corruption, the whole point you give pardons, the whole point you do anything is to make sure the right thing happens to the right people. Are you doing the right thing if innocent people are still behind bars? It doesn't matter if Trump can pardon just a few of his cronies. It doesn't matter if the president can let a few people go. But if that means the people who did nothing wrong still have a chance, justice still exists. At the beginning of this debate, I told you America cannot afford to be a dictatorship. Towards the end of this debate, I only have one ask. Keep it a democracy. Keep justice alive. Fail this policy.
Speech time 4 minutes, 2 seconds. Question is rise. Argument.
Hey, I would agree that congressional pardons are going to be a little political, right? Arguably, if it's one man making the decision versus 500, is 500 not less political?
No, it's not. It's
Why?
even more political because we're even more polarized.
If
I don't think.
presidents-
I don't think the president debates himself. 500 congressmen do debate.
Exactly. He doesn't debate himself because he has one ideological perspective. When we have 500 of
At
them,
least
why does that
pardons
not
are
allow
given.
for
I think the
pardons?
principle of a pardon is more important
Hold
than how
on.
they are.
We've already proved that some pardons will go through.
I can tell you.
Some.
Hi, Senator. I was letting 1,600 rioters who are willing to overturn a free and fair election protect democracy in this country.
It protects democracy because innocent people still have a chance of
Wait,
getting
if
pardoned.
you overturn the entire results of an election and you destroy democracy, how do you
I
protect
think
innocent
Republicans
people and
and
the rule of
Democrats.
law?
I think Republicans and Democrats can both agree that both of them lose if democracy dies, right? If there's no
But
Congress,
if one
neither
side
party
takes over the
benefits.
country, they benefit if democracy
I don't
dies.
think either side's trying to take over the country.
Donald Trump tried to take over
I
the Capitol.
don't. Checks and balances are still there. Failing this legislation keeps
Checks
those
and
checks and
balances
balances.
really is-
Thank you, Senators. Negation speakers rise. Or sorry, affirmative speakers rise. If you are standing, that goes to
Chair.
Yeah.
In the meanwhile, here we go. In the meanwhile, Senator Ashton called, last name D-A-N-G-A-L. Last time today speak. The day in the legislature is great. Hot coffee, intern-made paychecks, and of course, our best friends are lobbyists. But the day in the life of a prisoner is cold. Cold food, cold slab, and their best friend is the barbed wire. It's easy to think in these soft chairs that America's prisons rehabilitate. Live the life of a prisoner. You'll see it's impossible. Pass to create legislative clemency commissions that review and approve more commutative clemency, increasing rehabilitation while decreasing recidivism. Now, I want to reframe the entire scope of today's round. There are other, more used types of clemency than just the get out of jail free card. The Harvard Law Review in June of 2021 states, there are two main forms of clemency. The first is a full pardon. That's the get out of jail free card. But the second is a commutation. These reduce jail time for already incarcerated prisoners. In fact, Biden gave out over 4,000 commutations while only giving out 80 full pardons. That means commutations are far more widespread. That's what this round ought to focus on. So next, Senator Amu, Rafi, and Badalori all miscontextualize what the problem is right now and how today's solvency affects it. Senator Rafi gave you a cherry-picked number without contextualizing it. I'll give you a percentage to show that regardless of president, regardless of party, our modern presidents aren't pardoning nearly enough. The Prison Policy Initiative on April 21st of 2022 quantifies that Trump and Biden approved 75% less commutations than their pre-mass incarceration predecessors because they're too bureaucratic and don't have the resources to actually go through and read over all the clemency requests. Now let's crystallize today's solvency gridlock. Me and Senator Yin completely disagree with Senator Rafi, Amu, and Badalori's solvency. Giving Congress the power to pardon means that more pardons will be given out. Why? Legislative clemency commissions have the resources and less bureaucracy, meaning they can actually read the clemency requests, pass them over to Congress, and let us bipartisanly approve them. Here's the star evidence in today's round that ends this debate on gridlock. The Restoration of Rights Project on June 12, 2023 finds states with legislator-reviewed clemency boards give out 7 times as many commutations compared to states that leave clemency up to the governor. Senator Ralphie, a Middle that empirically extends Senator Nagion's valid logic. We weed out polarizing commutations and increase the sensible commutations. That's why the affirmative wins on that point. Now let's turn to Senator Ralphie's impact. Jason Hernandez and thousands of other Americans like him will be rehabilitated when we give out more commutations. Commutations decrease recidivism because they're only given out if a prisoner shows that they're willing to rehabilitate themselves. The Oregon Criminal Justice Commission in March of 2022 quantifies commuted prisoners have recidivism rates that are 48% less than the national average, at just 2% of prisoners being reincarcerated after 5 years. Guilty prisoners are still Americans. They have lives too. Don't let their darkness breed their retribution.
Speech time 4 minutes, 7 seconds. Questioners rise. Park.
How many clemency petitions are pending in the status quo?
A lot.
Yeah, 17,000. What happens when Congress is responsible for every single one?
We create a clemency legislative board, which we can fund because we're the power of the purse, so they can actually read through the 17,000 requests. Right now, the president's reading through like 84,000 a year.
Regardless of what we do as Congress, does that not take up our time as legislators?
Sure.
And does that not take away solutions we can provide to our communities?
It should take up our time to save lives.
What's the difference in polarization levels in states and the national government?
Tell me.
States are less polarized than the national government. How can we compare the two polarization changes?
It's the best comparison made in today's round.
No, it isn't. You're comparing like blue states and red states to a nation full of blue and red states.
And there's still polarized purple states like Nevada.
Not as badly. That's why we see elections that come in consensus among states. How can we compare the two?
It's the best gridlock solution given in
It's
this
not
round.
good.
We haven't even seen a single source that actually quantifies
Everyone on
the
my side has
gridlock.
told you that Congress is
Thank you, Senators.
Point of personal privilege
Take that.
to re-enter the chamber.
Granted.
Point of personal privilege.
Take that.
Granted.
Point of personal privilege. As a note to competitors, we just had 5 senators out of the chamber. As a note to competitors, when you're entering back in the room, please wait outside this room. Even though you think you may be quiet when opening the door, it is still distracting to competitors. That being said, we are now looking for a speech negation. Speakers, please rise. Park unopposed.
One last time, Senator Park, so glad to have debated this entire reading. Panel, you guys aren't ready, please let me know. In this debate, we've heard the word repair once. I want you to go back and consider how many times you've heard the word problem. Over 15 times. In this single debate, the word problem has been used 15 times more than any word signifying unity in this Congress. If that is not proof in and of itself that this chamber cannot agree, I do not know what else is. Strike down this legislation. Make sure that the principle of both good and bad existing is prioritized over nothing at all. As one of the last speakers in the negation, I want to remind everyone in this chamber of the comparative world in this debate. This debate is decided on whether or not a world where there are both good and bad pardons is better than one with no pardons at all. For the rest of my speech, I'm going to prove why the first option is an infinitely better alternative. First, let's do some comparative weighing for all of the arguments that's been presented in this round. My side, starting from Senator Ralphie, has told you that Biden-Obama's presidency saw a lot of good pardons. However, Senator Hagerin and Guo have told you that Trump's presidency saw bad pardons. You can look to 2020. You can look to 1920. Heck, you can look at 1792. Pardons in this country are not a good or bad thing. They are a ubiquitous policy that presidents are allowed to use. However, if you pass today's legislation, both good and bad pardons do not exist. Why? Senator Dental, it's simple. Even if it's just clemency that Congress has to work with, one man's signature still hasn't kept up. The Federal Prison Consultation Office finds in December 18th of 2024 that the Office of the Pardon Attorney, the very one that is filing and processing these claims to the President, have over 17,000 clemency requests in progress. Some of those requests have lasted for a decade. And, Senator Goenamu, these are things that are easily commutatable. The very simple fact that marijuana is a Schedule I drug under the federal government is proof that we are polarized. It is proof that we cannot agree on the justification to pardon an individual. And why should we tolerate the bad pardons? It's because this country was founded on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. Just because a couple guilty walk free is not a reason to make sure innocents remain behind bars. It is a principle that the legal system has built itself off of. I am morally opposed to flipping that script. But second, good and bad pardons implicate a flaw in our system. Everyone in this debate has forgotten what Senator Raouli has mentioned in the fourth speech in this debate. There are better solutions. Senator Song, I agree. Fraud and lack of democracy is bad. You can prevent pardons through another constitutional amendment. The analogy is pretty simple. I have two similar apples, both keep the doctor away. But one makes me as short as Senator Nguyen. I mean, it's really easy to understand. I don't want that side effect, so I'll always choose the best option. But finally, let's quantify what this legislation means for my constituents. Because when congressional gridlock increases by debating 17,000 clemency petitions, my constituents do not get representation. Students in my state of California cannot afford textbooks published after the 21st century. I do not want a Congress where they will never see social progress. Negate.
Each time 4 minutes, 3 seconds, questioners rise. Involved. Please wait until the question is.
Great speech. So the attorney is overburdened with 17,000
If one
requests,
president's
right?
signature is still overburdened, I don't see how 456 votes makes that any better.
Okay, how do we fix it?
How do we fix it? I see something that Senator Ralphie and I agree on. It's just making exceptions and guidelines to the pardon clause.
Okay, how does that reduce the backlog?
How does that reduce? There wouldn't be backlog if you just have that. There's going to be no problem. There's going to be none of the problems in negation brought up.
Even with that solution, it's still one person's sign, right?
Yeah, and then they can't abuse it.
Nguyen.
What defines a good pardon?
I mean, I'm sure it's one like Senator Ralphie mentioned. The one where someone benefits society by being pardoned.
If it's so good, there wouldn't be any pushback, right?
I mean, there's pushback because of controversy, but as I explained in my second...
Is that controversy always bad? Is it never a valid reason?
Controversy can be good and bad for different reasons. I say if this Congress has a problem with it being used for corrupt measures, we institute constitutional
If all of us
protections against
agree
corruption.
something is corrupt, we won't go for it, right? If something
And
isn't
the
corrupt, we
very
would
fact
go
we
for
have
it.
to debate about it takes away time
Thank
from
you,
my
Senators.
constituents.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Take
Chair.
that.
Point of personal privilege should be interesting.
Grander. Affirmation speakers, rise. Yes. tinyurl.com/Kumar. Affirmation speakers, rise. Between those screens.
All right. Okay.
For the second time in this legislative session, final time at DTOC ever. Senator Derringer, still spelled D-I-E-R-I-N-G-E-R. Once again, I'll just assume you're ready. If you're not, please give me a holler.
Real quick, if I can hear whispers from spectators from up here, I can only imagine what that sounds like for the judges. Please be respectful. We have 4 more speeches to go.
Like many aspects of our Constitution and our legal system, pardons as we know them originate in Britain. In the 7th century, the British monarchy created what was known as the prerogative of mercy, where the king could grant merciful treatment to criminals and convicts he believed rightly deserved that same mercy. But over time, the prerogative shifted from mercy to monarchical self-interest. That's why in 1689, British Parliament passed a Bill of Rights that transferred the power of pardons from the king to Parliament. And ever since, the British system has been more accountable. But when building our own constitution, Congress forgot to learn from Britain's mistakes. Today, follow in the footsteps of their democracy and pass this legislation. The singular question that decides this round and has defined this debate is which side of the House better increases pardons for those who actually deserve them. Senators Huckabee, Waiufi, Amu, Baudelaire, and Park all come up here and tell you that the presidency is the ideal pathway to granting clemency and pardons, especially for nonviolent offenders. They tell you that just because Presidents Trump, Biden, Obama, etc. all granted X amounts of clemency to people, that's better because Congress will never achieve the same thing. But here's the reality. The president, historically, and as of late especially, has been ignoring the need of nonviolent criminals. New York University's Journal of Legislation and Public Policy explains on March 12, 2024, that when the Office of the Pardon Advocate within the Department of Justice recommended some 9,000 offers of clemency to President Biden, he only acted on 1.5% of them. Senator Park, it doesn't matter if the OPA is overburdened if the president isn't willing to act on that information in the first place. The president in the status quo rewards people the president is close to because there's more political capital gained from that than there is from pardoning nonviolent criminals. That's why Jack Goldsmith of Harvard Law School found that since the beginning of President Trump's first term, 89% of presidential pardons and clemencies have gone to people with personal connections to the presidency. Senator Baudelaire tells you President Trump helped pardon people. She also tells you he pardoned 10 nonviolent criminals. That's not sufficient when Congress can do so much better. The one question that my side has failed to meet this entire debate is an example of how Congress can create the consensus that actually helps nonviolent criminals. The best we seem to have offered is gold medals, which Senator Baudelaire rightly characterizes as apples to oranges. But let me bring up the First Step Act, which the Brennan Center for Justice tells you in 2020 passed the House and the Senate with unanimous consent and stripped back criminal proceedings for nonviolent criminals, 3,000 of them. President Trump pardoned 10 nonviolent offenders. With one bill, we helped 3,000 get out early. But that was only the first step, because Congress doesn't have the ability to pardon people who are currently sitting in prison. You passed this legislation, Senator Baudelaire and Senator Lagu, because you set the rules, you pardon people, you help nonviolent criminals get out. When the Prison Policy Initiative tells you on March 11th of this year that some 360,000 people currently sit in our prisons because of nonviolent drug crimes, and 1 million more people are serving other nonviolent sentences, that's 1.3 million people our presidents acted on 10 of them. When you pass this legislation and you transfer pardon power to Congress, when you enable us to define who gets pardons and who gets clemency, we can pass legislation like the First Step Act, maybe call it the Second Step Act, that systematically redefines penalties and pardons and enables people to get out early. But why is reducing mass incarceration so absolutely critical to this debate? The Institute for Justice Research and Development finds on June 11, 2023, that when you release a nonviolent offender from prison, they become 65% more likely to get a job when you give them pardons or clemency that restore their criminal record. When you enable Congress to systematically continue our reductions of mass incarceration, you help 1.3 million Americans achieve better lives. Because if they have to sit around and wait for a president that has no incentive to act on it and hasn't, they languish. It took Britain 1,000 years to wrestle back pardon power. It only takes you one vote. Pass.
Speech time, 4 minutes, 5 seconds. Question is rise.
Hey, Senator, how many Congress people would you have to convince to reach the 2/3 consensus?
Quite a few, but we passed
78.
Yeah, we passed the First Step Act with unanimous consent.
Can you give me an example of a pardon that would unite 78 Congress people?
Sure, you gave it the Second Step Act and you pardoned those same people.
Which pardons are you talking about?
I'm a fake senator, I don't have real constituents. This is not a fair question. But the First Step Act took care of thousands of people. We can take care of the 1.3 million
pardons can you say are not politicized?
The First Step Act is passed by bipartisan support.
How are we going to agree on pardons if you can't name a single one?
Again, I think this is a really unfair question.
Why?
When you consider that we passed the First Step Act with unanimous consent that pardoned thousands of people categorically. That's exactly the problem.
having to wait on a president to individually pardon people results in less action than wide systemic reform.
Sure, let's talk about the president. What's one big example of a type of pardon that presidents have done historically?
They have like clemency for certain offenders, but they can also pardon their own friends. I told you they do that more often.
Which one's more important, protecting innocent people or keeping guilty people?
Innocent people. That's why you passed this law.
Thank you, Senators. Negation speakers, rise.
Thank you. For the second time today, and final one, my name is Senator Quasi, spelled Q-U-A-Z-I. Once again, Q-U-A-Z-I. Just let me know if you're not ready, or else I'll be happy to begin. Great. Trending Google searches can tell this Congress a lot about what our people are thinking about. After the 2024 president election, there was a 250% increase in the search, do tariffs increase prices? After people found out, indeed, yes, tariffs do increase prices, and just how bad that increase was, there was a 700% increase in the search, can I change my vote? Evidently, when we have an affirmation who's too focused on the power of one president, it forces us to create short-sighted policy that doesn't consider the holistic implications. It's because that harm continues in today's debate that I ask you to fail this legislation. At the end of today's debate, the affirmation can be brought down into two primary arguments. First, Senator Harriam, Power Ortiz, Wynn, and the rest of the affirmation argue you should pass this legislation to prevent self and politically connected pardons from occurring through presidents. But there's three reasons why this legislation doesn't solve that problem, and if anything, makes it worse. First, even if you buy this argument, I think it's in need of critical weighing against Senator Raouf's argument about protecting non-violent drug offenders and Senator Huckabridge's argument about protecting people who are put on death row. Even in the worst case scenario, and if president does pardon one of his cronies or one of his political supporters, we haven't heard a single impact in today's debate about what they did after they were pardoned. Senator Song, I sympathize with you about condemning rioters, but they haven't done anything ever since they've been pardoned. On the other hand, innocent people are harmed every single day when they aren't pardoned. The Prison Policy Initiative finds on March 11th of 2025 that non-violent drug offenders that are kept in prison are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression and mental health problems. Senator Guo, Natal, and the rest of the affirmation. I am much more concerned about protecting those innocent people than continuously worrying about guilty ones being free. We need to protect our constituents while holding others accountable, but today's legislation doesn't do either. Second, Senator Wynn and Guo come up here with the best arguments on the affirmation when they tell you that a 2/3 majority is actually possible. Senator Wynn talks about how when it comes to pardons, Congress will always agree more. No, let's talk about one of the biggest examples of a presidential pardon power. Data from the Department of Justice finds in 2022 that during President Biden's administration, nearly 2/3 of his pardons were single-handedly for non-violent drug offenders. However, Congress is the most divided when it comes to this problem. You cannot convince me that we will ever agree in a 2/3 majority about freeing those innocent civilians, but presidents can. Preserving that power in the status quo will always be objectively better than passing this legislation and destroying our ability to ever stop that problem in the first place. This finalizes the clash on gridlock. We will not agree on pardons, and nobody will be set free. The negation ultimately wins on that one single point. Third, and finally, I'd actually argue that today's legislation could actually make politically connected pardons an objectively worse problem. Why? Lobbying. When large power players like oil companies are able to lobby power over this Congress, in fact, nearly 2/3 of us are already lobbied, they're able to control our decisions when they're put into prison, and we can't hold them accountable. The Brookings Institution gives just one example. Dinesh D'Soto, who was put into prison and could have been pardoned because of their own political connections to Congress, actually inhibited our own constituents' rights, increasing gas prices and causing financial fraud. That's how it impacts today's round and the average American. We need to hold them accountable. Today's legislation doesn't allow that. Finally, Senator Paul Ortiz, Wynn, and Song all say that this legislation encourages bipartisan legislation. Fail, because this legislation does the exact opposite. Look back towards Senator Bonamuri's argument. We can never convince each other to pass proposals, we can never make those proposals, and we only disagree. Fail this legislation.
Speech time 4 minutes, 6 seconds, questioners rise. Warren.
At its most basic, are pardons the only way someone can get exonerated?
Not the only.
No, right? So why would you pass legislation that lets bad people off the hook if those good people have other options?
Because those good people, like nonviolent drug offenders, don't really have any other options.
Wait, you just told me they do. What are you talking about?
Nonviolent drug offenders don't.
Why not?
One of the only other ways someone could get out of prison is proving their innocence while they're in prison. There's not really any other way. A nonviolent drug offender can't prove that because they were.
Okay, so that's a small portion, but you're telling me
It's not a small portion.
No,
It's
you're telling me on the net, the
Whoa. Same question I asked Rayufi.
Yeah.
If Biden already pardoned nonviolent drug offenders in such a big bulk, if another one comes in, how can we reasonably decline them?
Because we already disagree on that problem?
Wait, no, but Biden set a precedent that nonviolent drug offenders are should to be pardoned.
Yeah.
How are we going to reset?
So this Congress is the one who made it illegal to have marijuana, so I don't see why we would pardon
Wait,
someone
answer
for
the question. How
created.
are they going to disrespect that precedent reasonably?
Because we have objectively already done so by making marijuana legal in the United States.
That's been illegal for years.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senators. Affirmative speakers, rise. Warren.
Thank the chair. The second and final time today, that's Senator Horn, spelled H-O-R-N-E. Once again, Senator Horn, H-O-R-N-E. Judges, just like before. Is anyone not ready? Every single day, I break the law. When I wake up in the morning and cross the street without looking for a crosswalk, that's crime number 1. When I drive my car and go a single mile over the speed limit, that's crime number 2. But when I sit in this chamber and don't consider my constituents with my ballot, that's not a crime. It's just complacency. Give your ballot the weight it deserves. Don't let partisanship override preference for your constituents. At the end of this debate, pass this legislation. In order to promote bipartisanship, I'll work with the negation here. I'll look under both layers of your analysis and provide it's a reason to vote for the affirmation. So let's start with bipartisanship as an example. Now, Senator Rye and Park tell you that pardons are always in some way polarized. I completely agree with this layer of analysis, but I'll tell you that polarization doesn't mean we can't agree on things. Senator Amu, Ralphie, Baudelaire, and Quasi are all so pessimistic about our ability to agree, they'd probably look at the back of this chamber and tell me it's half empty. I'm not so pessimistic. I'm willing to tell you that we can agree when it matters the most. Senator Quasi, Senator Ralphie, Senator Park, you all give me the example of marijuana pardons. Look to how we bipartisanly agreed that those were a good thing. As Data for Progress tells us on October 14th of 2022, after Biden pardoned those convicted of marijuana possession, 78% of Democrats, 74% of independents, and 55% of Republicans all agreed that was a good thing. The Republicans and the Democrats both supported it. You can't tell me that you don't agree with it when the data shows otherwise. At the end of the day, we can get bipartisanship. We've seen it in the past. We'll see it in again. But then, let's take Raufi and Baudelaire at their highest ground and assume that not a single polarized pardon could ever get passed. At the end of the day, I still think there's not a reason to negate here. Now, Senator Amu and Huckelbridge tell you that's the only way someone can ever get out of a crime. But just like I just told Senator Quasi, that's simply not true. As the Death Penalty Information Center tells you on March 14th of 2025, just last year, 153 people were exonerated off of death row. They didn't need the presidential pardon to do it, they used other methods. At your highest ground, every single impact about innocent people not getting off doesn't count up. But finally, I'll tell you the reason to vote in the affirmation is because we simply make the pardon more effective. The Office for Pardon Authority tells you in their entire data set that Biden closed 10,000 pardons without ever considering them. Trump, 7,000. Obama, 4,000. Senator Amu, you tell us that this Congress would never consider those who are asking for release.
Our president already isn't doing that. At the end of the day, when you increase the people considering a pardon from 1 to over 400, that's more people to look at your constituents, more people to consider their innocence, more people to vote to protect them. Senator Ralphie, Amu, and Park all tell us that voting takes too long. 2 reasons why that's also incorrect. Now, Senator Powerty's already told you one of them. It's that we don't have to vote one at a time. Look to how the president is already acting. In the status quo, he votes in and he pardons multiple people at a time. I simply reject anyone in the negation who tells me this is too inefficient because we have to vote one at a time. President Biden didn't sign tens of thousands of pardons one at a time. He signed them all together, just like we do in this chamber. But then you can assume that every single vote has to be considered in the entire Congress. We can look at them individually, find the ones that count, and vote for them there. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let bad people get off the hook. Make the weight of the ballot shine. Vote for the affirmation.
Speech time 4 minutes, 10 seconds. Questioners rise. Between those standing, rise.
I agree that there are other options other than pardons, but are they as fast as pardons are to be issued?
I'd tell you they're faster. The fact is the president isn't considering most of the pardons he's getting. At the end of the day, they can use other methods.
Longer. Fighting for exoneration or just the president signing their pen?
Sorry?
What takes longer, getting the exoneration or the president just signing their pen?
Wait, but the president isn't signing the pen. I just told you that in my speech.
Wait, but if the president can still do it faster, isn't that a
He
reason?
can do it, he's not. They can use other methods to do it, even at your
Why
house.
don't you reform how pardons are written?
Yeah. There's a difference between operating in optimism, pessimism, and reality,
Yeah.
right? In what reality do all of us agree to support pardons?
Wait, it's not that all of us have to agree. 2/3 do. I gave you data.
2/3 of 435.
Yeah,
Still
and
a
I
very
gave you
large
data
number.
that more than 2/3 of
Okay,
Republicans
I'm
and
reading your
Democrats.
data. You said 72% of Congress people
Yeah.
that supported rights. 72% of voters.
Yeah.
Voters are not Congress
Wait,
people.
Congress people literally represent the views of their voters.
Right.
If the voters support it, so do the Congress.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Negation speakers, rise. Senator Vice President.
I think the chair.
Is that a motion?
Motion for personal preference.
State that.
Exit the chamber.
Refuse to reference, please don't make motion after speakers.
For the chamber's reference, that's Senator Bhattacharya, spelled Bhattacharya. It's just as long as last time. Awesome. Could I get an indication if my judges are not ready? I've served on this Congress for 2 terms now. And if I'm being honest, I'm pretty surprised I got back here in the first place. I mean, after I sold my constituents' data to Big Pharma so I could get an all-expensive trip to the Bahamas, I'm so lucky that they forgave me. But it's because my constituents were so generous enough to forgive me. I believe that this Congress shows the same mercy on them. Failed today's legislation. So far, I think my side's done a great job proving why this legislation is so detrimental. So, as the last speaker in today's debate, I'm going to go through the affirmation's 2 biggest points and prove why those are the reasons that you failed. First, Representative Nguyen, Guo, Pariem, and Duntal all tell you that it's okay if there's less pardons because at least you have a decision that's reflective of the entire population. Representative Amu and Badaluri, already on my side, explained to you that we never see pardons because the chance of seeing a 2/3 majority is really little. But I want to explain why that happens just to simplify it for this debate. According to the New York Times in 2024, senators tend to disagree with policy just because senators on the other side disagree with the policy. Representative Duntal, the reason why Mitch McConnell wouldn't pardon a marijuana user is because Rick Scott would. That's really important. Representative Duringer tells you that Trump only pardoned 10 people without connection to him. I'd argue that's 10 more people than we see in the affirmation world. But then Representative Duntal comes up here and gives you a stat about states and how when they have a review, we see more parties in the status quo. Okay, but states are inherently less polarized than an entire nation of red and blue states. That's not a good reason to prove why you have to pass. So far, the affirmation has given you that if you think positively, maybe, potentially, we'll see a pardon. My side has history on their side. You have to fail today's legislation. But second, the affirmation representatives Nguyen and Duntal both tell you that presidential pardons occur around the party lines, and that's bad. Even if you ignore Representative Amu, Central in 2025 explains that pardons give hope to the people that they could get out of their current situation. As a result, they increase good behavior as a result of operant conditioning, which basically means if you have a reward, you're more likely to work for it. The problem is, Representative Powerties, when you pass today's legislation, that chance goes down. You have to fail because my side has proven to you that the chance of Congress granting a pardon is less than 1%. That incentive goes away because why would I try for something I virtually have no shot at getting? That makes no sense. And insofar that not a single affirmation senator, not only Harvard again, Guo, Nguyen, Paul Ortiz, Song, and Dantal, none of them have proved to you that after a pardon, reoffenders offend more than actual recidivism rates. The Office of Justice Programs tells us that when you receive a pardon, you are 35% less likely than your average criminal to reoffend. That means what would happen is that you see less recidivism once someone is pardoned. I'd argue, if you're not hurting the population, it is so important for this Congress to show mercy, especially when we have one of the worst reputations than we have ever had in the history of the United States. Mercy is one of the things that makes this Congress nice. Representative Song, also, remember that the people who ended up reoffending weren't just anyone. They were non-violent drug offenders. If you have an addiction, you're likely to fall into those patterns. Again, it's not hurting anyone. You have to fail today's legislation. Representatives, let's remember, a nation that can't forgive is also a nation that can't heal the trauma of their constituents. The hand that can pardon should never be the one shackled by bureaucracy. Please, stand with me and show our constituents that we will be better for them. Fail today's legislation.
Speech time 3 minutes, 59 seconds. Questioners rise. Deringer.
Hi. Under this legislation, if Congress controls pardons, why can't we just systematically commute or pardon thousands of nonviolent offenders?
I literally just explained to you that the reason why is because if Representative Amu believes something, I'm likely to go against that policy.
Yeah, okay. Why then did every single member of this Congress vote for the First Step Act in 2018?
Okay, see, right now we're significantly more polarized than we were in 2018. It's been over like 7 years.
Okay, sure. But if we all want to help nonviolent offenders, doesn't this bill make it easier for us to do that?
Again, nonviolent offenders are still
We're in control.
If our constituents support a certain type of pardon or they don't support it, why won't we follow that decision?
Okay, wait, I have 2 responses to this. First, Congress tends to act where money is. So if someone's paying me, I'm more likely to vote around those lines. But second, it's very unlikely that Congress actually reflects their constituents, especially right now.
Why not? If they want to get reelected, they're gonna have to reflect their
Wait, there's
constituents,
so many
right?
senators that have been reelected even after going against their citizens.
Okay, but in the vast majority of cases, though, people want to get reelected by representing their
And they
constituents,
still
no?
do. That's the problem because people tend to vote around the party lines.
In the vast majority of cases.
Thank you, senators. I thank the chair.
Motion to move to previous question.
Second. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, we are now moving to the previous question and then hand it over.
Cool. Yeah, to be fairness, I'm going to do this again, and plus I like to talk. But I didn't do that a lot. Well, actually, all right, cool. If you're in favor of passing this motion, oh yes, state your motion. Please.
Thank you.
Oh yes. She's like, good. All right, cool. If you are in favor of passing this piece of legislation, please raise your placard. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you are in favor of opposing this piece of legislation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I am going to assume the role of presiding officer now, and I'm going to say we're going to pass this piece of legislation. Congratulations. Oh, wait, never mind. It's a constitutional amendment. Thank you. I am done. All right, cool. We are not going to pass this piece of legislation, or this amendment. Thank you all for competing. Let's give everybody a round of applause. It is still really important that the judges have time to fill out their ballots and can actually think clearly. So for a little bit of time, I'm going to ask the spectators, the competitors, to take a moment, let the judges actually, including myself, let the judges have a moment of silence for us to actually fill out the paperwork.
Actually, what we are going to do is this. Awards are going to be at 2:30. What I'm going to ask everybody to do is please exit. Don't eat. Food is important. Lunch is good. Relax, especially competitors. You need to unwind. We will meet back up at 2:30 in, I think, Man-O-War. Judges, please stay here and fill out your ballots, and I can be here to help you anyway.